Run. You're useless out here, so run. Senior Chief Mason Vickers screamed those words at Evelyn Carter, with rounds cracking past both their heads, and then he did something no leader should ever do. He shoved her, hard, into the dirt away from the wounded man bleeding out beside them, and he called her the thing he always called her, spitting it like poison through the gunfire. Get back, bandage girl. Let the real operators handle this. He turned his back on her, and that single turn of his back, that dismissal, was the biggest mistake he would make in his entire career. Before this story goes any further, if you believe a person's worth should never be measured by the uniform others expect them to wear, take 1 second to subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you are watching from right now, because I truly want to see how far Evelyn's story travels tonight. Firebase Anchor sat 11,000 feet up in a mountain range that God seemed to have forgotten in a contested corner of a ward that most people back home had stopped thinking about. It was cold in a way that got into your bones and stayed there, and the wind never fully quit, and 40 men lived inside a ring of sandbags and concertina wire waiting for a war that came whenever it felt like coming. Evelyn Carter had been there 41 days. She was the medic. That was the whole of her as far as the team was concerned. 5'6", quiet brown hair, pulled back tight, hands that never shook. She spoke when spoken to, and not much more than that. And in 41 days, not one of the operators at Firebase Anchor had bothered to learn a single true thing about her because they had already decided everything they needed to know the moment she'd stepped off the resupply bird. Great, Mason Vickers had said that first day loud enough for everyone to hear loud enough that he wanted her to hear. They sent us a nurse, the men had laughed. That laughter set the tone, and the tone never changed. But here's the thing about Evelyn Carter that Mason Vickers did not know that none of them knew. She was not counting the days until she went home. She was counting something else entirely. And every single day at that fire base, while they mocked her and shoved past her and forgot her name, she was building. 3 things, quietly, patiently, where no one would ever look, ever. The first was a medical log, and everyone knew about that one because a medic keeping a medical log was the most ordinary thing in the world. What they did not know was how she kept it. She did not just write down injuries and treatments. She wrote down distances. When a man came in wounded, she noted where he'd been standing, how far the shot had traveled, the angle it had entered, whether the enemy had led their target or fired flat. To Mason Vickers, it was paperwork. To Evelyn, it was a map of how the enemy shot drawn in the blood of the men she saved. The second thing was a terrain map, not the official one pinned up in the operations tent, the one the officers used. Hers. She walked the perimeter every morning under the excuse of checking on the sentries, and every morning she memorized a little more. The dead ground where a man could hide, the finger of rock that jutted out over the valley floor, the high spur to the northeast that the sun hit first each dawn. She had names for all of them, private names, and she carried the whole valley folded up inside her head like a letter she read to herself at night. She called the finger of rock the tooth. She had been studying the tooth for 12 days. The third thing was the one that would have gotten her thrown off the fire base if anyone had found it, and it was the one she guarded most carefully of all. A wind log. Every day, 3 times a day, she recorded the wind, direction, speed, how it changed as it climbed the valley walls, how the cold air sank in the mornings and the warm air rose in the afternoons, and how right around the middle of the day, the two of them collided somewhere over the valley floor and made the air do strange, treacherous things. She logged the mirage that shimmered off the rocks when the sun was high. She logged the way a flag on the far tower stood out stiff in one direction while the dust at her feet drifted in another. She was not a medic keeping notes. She was a shooter building a firing solution for a valley she had never once been allowed to fire into. Her grandfather had taught her. That was the secret underneath all the other secrets. Thomas Carter had been a Marine Scout sniper across 2 wars, and when Evelyn was 7 years old and small enough to sit on his knee, he had started teaching her to read the wind by watching a curtain move. By 12, she could dope a scope. By 16, she was out shooting grown men at the range, and they hated her for it, and her grandfather would laugh, his low, quiet laugh, and say the thing he always said. Don't guess, Evie. Guessers miss. You calculate. Every single time you calculate. And when the whole world is screaming and everybody around you is panicking, that's when you go quiet and you do the math. The math doesn't panic. The math is always there. He was gone now. 3 years gone, and she had joined up and become a medic because that was the door they opened for her, and she had walked through it, and she had never stopped being the girl on his knee, learning to read a curtain in the wind. But nobody at Firebase Anchor knew any of that. To them, she was the nurse, the bandage girl, and so she stayed quiet and she built her 3 systems and she waited. The morning it all began to turn was the morning she asked one more time to qualify. She stood in the doorway of the operations tent with her request in her hand, and Mason Vickers looked up from his coffee and looked at the paper and looked at her, and his face did the thing it always did, which was to arrange itself into a kind of patient, tired contempt. You want to what? I want to qualify beyond the pistol, Senior Chief. Her voice was flat and even. Rifle qualification, I'm requesting range time. Mason set his coffee down. Carter, you're a medic. I'm aware of my job, Senior Chief. Then do your job. Your job is to keep my men breathing when they get hit. Your job is not to add yourself to the list of people I have to worry about getting hit. He picked the coffee back up. Request denied, same as last time, same as it's gonna be next time. Dismissed. She did not argue, she never argued. She folded the paper and she left. But a man named Jonah Pike had been sitting in the corner of that tent cleaning his weapon, and Jonah Pike had watched the whole thing, and Jonah Pike was starting to notice things about the medic that were beginning to keep him up at night. Jonah had been an operator for 11 years. He was good at his job for a lot of reasons, but the biggest reason was that he paid attention. He read rooms, he read people, and the medic was starting to read wrong. Wrong in a way he couldn't put his finger on, like a word spelled almost correctly. It started with the panic, or rather with the total absence of it. 2 weeks earlier, the firebase had taken indirect fire mortars walking in across the compound in the dark, and Jonah had watched 40 trained men do what trained men do, which is move fast and hard and with a certain electric edge of fear running under all the training. Everybody had it. Everybody. It was normal. It was human. Everybody except the medic. He'd found her in the aid station, and she was not moving fast. She was moving smoothly. She had laid out her gear before the first round even landed, which meant she'd heard the tube pop from a mile out and known what was coming before anyone else did. And when the wounded started arriving, she worked on them with a stillness that Jonah had only ever seen in one kind of person in his entire life. Not in doctors, not in nurses, in snipers. That flat, patient, unhurried calm that comes from a person who has trained their nervous system to disconnect fear from motion. He'd seen it in the best long gun men he'd ever worked with. He had never once seen it in a support medic on her 41st day at a mountain fire base. So he started watching. He watched where she sat in the chow tent. Every time, without fail, back to the wall facing the entrance with a clear line to the exit and a clear line to every other person in the room. He watched her walk the perimeter in the mornings, and he noticed she never walked it the same way twice. And she always stopped in the same 3 places, and she always stood in those 3 places looking out at the valley for exactly as long as it took a person to memorize what they were looking at. He watched her lick her thumb one afternoon and hold it up and turn her head and watch the dust move, and then write something in a small book that was not her medical log. And then one day he watched a round come in. It was a single shot from a sniper on the far ridge. A harassing shot, the kind they took now, and then just to remind everyone they were being watched. It cracked off a sandbag 6 feet from where a young operator named Remy was standing, and Remy hit the deck the way you're supposed to, and every man in the yard flinched and dropped and got small. Evelyn did not drop. She turned her head toward the sound, and Jonah from across the yard watched her eyes track back along the flight of the bullet up the valley to the ridge to a spot on the ridge, and she held on that spot for 1 second, 2 seconds, and Jonah could have sworn, he could have sworn on his own life that she was not afraid of the shooter. She was ranging him. That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, and he ran it over and over, and around 2 in the morning it came to him all at once, the whole ugly shape of it, and it was so simple and so obvious that he almost laughed. She wasn't untrained. She was restrained. Somebody somewhere had taken a person who moved like a shooter and thought like a shooter and read the wind like a shooter, and they had handed her a bag of bandages and told her that was all she'd ever be. And she had said nothing. And she had waited. And she was still waiting right now tonight for something the rest of them couldn't see coming. He found her the next morning at the aid station. Carter, she looked up. Pike. He didn't quite know how to say it. He'd rehearsed it in his head, and it had sounded fine, and now standing here, it sounded insane, so he just said the true thing. Who taught you to read wind? For 1/2 of 1 second, something moved behind her eyes. He almost missed it. It was there, and then it was gone, a door opening and closing so fast you'd swear you imagined it. "Excuse me," she said. "I've been watching you for 2 weeks. You sit facing the door. You range incoming fire instead of ducking it. You keep a wind book. I've seen it. You dope the valley 3 times a day like you're building a solution." He kept his voice low. "So I'm asking you a straight question, and I'd take it as a kindness if you'd give me a straight answer. Who taught you?" She looked at him for a long moment, and Jonah understood in that moment that she was making a decision, and that the decision was not about whether to trust him, but about whether he was worth the risk of being known. "My grandfather," she said finally, quietly. "Marine Scout sniper. 2 wars. He started teaching me when I was 7. Jonah let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "How good are you?" "He was the best I ever saw." She capped a bottle of saline and set it down with that same smooth economy of motion he'd seen 100 times now and never understood until this exact second. "And I was better than him by the time I was 17. He told me so himself. It's the only time I ever saw him crying." Jonah stared at her. "Then why in God's name are you carrying a med bag?" And for the first time in 41 days, something like a real emotion crossed Evelyn Carter's face. It was not anger. It was something older and more worn down than anger. It was the tired look of a person who has explained the same true thing to the same wall 1,000 times. "Because when I qualified," she said, "I outshot every man in my class, every one. And the range officer wrote in my file that my scores were, quote, statistically improbable and likely the result of a testing irregularity. They made me shoot it again. I outshot them again. So they wrote it down as a lucky day." She smiled, and there was no joy in it at all. "You know what a man gets when he shoots like I shoot Pike? He gets a school slot. He gets a spotter. He gets a career. You know what a woman gets? She gets accused of cheating. Twice. And then she gets handed a bag of bandages because that's the box they already built for her before she ever walked in the door." Jonah didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "So I stopped arguing," she said, turning back to her work. "My grandfather taught me something more important than shooting. He taught me that you don't waste ammunition on targets that don't matter. Vickers doesn't matter. The range officer doesn't matter. Their opinion of me is a target that doesn't matter." She looked at him one more time. "But the wind matters. The valley matters. So I keep my book. And I wait." "Wait for what?" She held his eyes. "For the day they're wrong about me and it costs them. Because a day like that always comes. My grandfather said it always comes." She went back to sorting her supplies. "I just intend to be ready when it does." Jonah walked out of that aid station a changed man, though he didn't fully know it yet. He walked out carrying a secret that felt heavier than his rifle, and he found himself in the days that followed doing a thing he'd never done for anyone at that firebase. He started watching her back, not because she asked. She didn't ask for anything. He did it because he had looked at her and seen a weapon that the whole command had left rusting in a corner, and it made him sick, and it made him quietly, coldly certain that they were all going to regret it. He tried once to say something to Vickers. He caught the senior chief after evening chow, and he chose his words carefully. "Senior chief, the medic, Carter." Vickers didn't even look up. "I think she's got more range experience than her file shows. I think we should get her some trigger time. Might be an asset." Mason Vickers laughed. He actually laughed. "Pike, did she get to you? She's got you carrying her water now." He shook his head, still grinning. "She's a medic, a good one, I'll give her, that the girl can stitch. But she's not an operator, and she never will be. And the day I put a long gun in the hands of somebody whose whole job is to stay calm and stay back is the day you can relieve me of command. Now let it go." "Senior Chief, I've been doing this 11 years, and I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes." "And I've been doing it 20, Vickers said, and the humor was gone from his voice now, and what was underneath it was hard and final. "You saw a medic who doesn't flinch. Good. That's what I want in a medic. It does not make her a shooter. Now I said let it go, and I mean let it go, or I'll start wondering why one of my operators is spending so much time thinking about a woman he shouldn't be thinking about at all. Are we clear?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "Clear, Senior Chief." He walked away, and that was the last time anyone tried to warn Mason Vickers, and it wouldn't have mattered anyway because some men can only learn one way, and it's the hard way, and the mountain was already sharpening itself for the lesson. The next morning, the mission came down. A routine patrol. Move down into the valley, sweep a village that intel said had gone quiet, check on a road that a convoy needed to use in 3 days. In and out, a milk run. The kind of patrol they'd run a dozen times without a shot fired. Evelyn stood in the back of the briefing tent because she was still the medic, and the medic went where the patrol went in case somebody got hurt. She listened to Vickers lay out the route, and Jonah watched her, and he saw her eyes go distant in a way he now understood. She wasn't listening to the plan. She was overlaying the route onto the valley she carried in her head. She was doing the math on ground she'd never been permitted to walk. And Jonah saw the exact moment she found the problem. Her eyes stopped, moving, fixed on a point on the map, and her whole body went very still. She raised her hand. Vickers stopped mid-sentence. The whole tent turned. A medic raising a hand in a tactical briefing was not something that happened. What Vickers said, not a question, a dare. Senior Chief. Her voice was calm and clear, and it carried. The route takes us through the low ground at grid 472 past the eastern spur. Request we reroute along the northern shelf instead. You could have heard a pin drop. Vickers set down his pointer. And why, he said slowly, would a medic have an opinion about my route? Because at that time of morning, the sun will be behind the eastern spur, Evelyn said. It'll silhouette us against the valley floor for anyone sitting up on that high ground, and it'll blind us looking back at them. The wind through that low ground runs uphill from about 0900, which carries our sound straight up to the ridgeline before we ever get eyes on it. And the low ground at 472 is a natural funnel. If I wanted to kill a patrol senior chief, that is exactly where I would set the ambush. Machine gun on the eastern spur. RPGs on the reverse slope, a shooter on the high ridge to pick off anyone who breaks and runs. It's the only place in the whole valley where all 4 of those things line up. And we're walking right into the middle of it at the exact worst hour of the day. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was without question the single most detailed piece of terrain analysis that had ever come out of the mouth of anyone at Firebase Anchor, and it had come from the bandage girl, and the sheer wrongness of that fact hung in the air like smoke. And Mason Vickers, God help him, could not stand it. He could have said, "That's interesting, let me think about it." He could have said, "Good catch, we'll reroute." Any leader who wasn't drowning in his own pride could have found 100 ways to take the free gift she just handed him. Instead, he smiled that thin, cold smile, and he said, "You've really got the whole thing figured out, huh? The wind, the sun, where you'd put your machine guns." He let it sit. You ever actually been in an ambush, Carter? You ever fired a shot in anger in your life? No, Senior Chief? No, right. He turned back to the map, dismissing her, dismissing the whole thing. We move at 0800 on the original route. The low ground's faster, and I'm not adding 40 minutes to a milk run because the medic read a weather book. If it makes you feel better, you can stay at the back, way at the back, where you belong. A few of the men chuckled. Anything else, no good. Kid up. Jonah caught her eye across the tent as the men filed out. She wasn't angry. That was the thing that chilled him. She wasn't even surprised. She just gave him one small look, and in that look was a whole sentence, and the sentence was, "Here it comes." He fell in beside her as they walked out into the cold gray morning. "He's wrong," Jonah said quietly. "I know," Evelyn said. "You want me to try him again? I can—" "No." She was already checking her med bag, already moving with that smooth economy. "He's decided. Men like Vickers don't change their minds because of words. They only change because of consequences." She slung the bag. "So we're going to walk into that valley pike. And when it happens, and it's going to happen, I need you to remember one thing for me. Name it." She looked at him, and for the first time he saw underneath the calm, all the way down to the bottom of her, and what was down there was not fear. It was readiness. Total, absolute 41 days in the making readiness. "There's a finger of rock on the western side of the low ground," she said. "It sticks out over the valley floor. I call it the tooth. It's got a clear line to the eastern spur and the reverse slope and most of the high ridge, and the wind up there is the one place in the whole valley I can read cold because I've been reading it for 12 days. She said it like she was giving him a set of coordinates to remember for later because that's exactly what she was doing. If it all goes the way I think it's going to go, that's where I'll be. The tooth. Remember it. Carter. Jonah's mouth had gone dry. You don't even have a rifle. He won't let you carry anything but the pistol. Evelyn Carter looked out at the valley she had memorized inch by inch over 41 days, at the low ground, in the eastern spur, and the high ridge, at the whole beautiful, terrible killing field that Mason Vickers was about to march 40 men straight into. When the shooting starts, she said, there are going to be rifles everywhere, lying in the dirt, next to men who can't use them anymore. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder. I won't need to be issued one. I'll just need to pick one up. And then she stepped off into the cold toward the low ground at the back of the column, where they had put her carrying nothing but a bag of bandages in a valley full of secrets, in every calculation her grandfather had ever taught her, humming quietly behind her eyes, like a loaded weapon waiting for a hand. Behind her, Mason Vickers checked his watch and called the time. 0800. The patrol moved out of the wire and down the mountain, 40 men and one medic, and the sun climbed slowly toward the eastern spur, and the wind through the low ground began right on schedule to shift and run uphill toward the waiting ridge. She had told them exactly where and exactly how and exactly why. And they had laughed at the bandage girl one last time. They made it 40 minutes into the low ground before the valley proved her right. The column had strung out the way columns do, point element up. Up front, Vickers in the middle where a senior chief belongs, and Evelyn dead last 40 meters back, exactly where he'd put her. She walked with her head slightly down, but her eyes never stopped moving, and Jonah, who had drifted back toward the rear against orders because he couldn't help himself, watched her count. He knew now what she was doing. She was ticking off the features she'd memorized from a mountain she'd never been allowed to climb. The eastern spur on their left going gold as the sun cleared it. The reverse slope beyond. The high ridge to the north. The finger of rock on the west that she called the tooth. She'd told him the wind ran uphill through here after 0900. It was 0840, and Jonah felt the first breath of it touch the back of his neck and start to climb toward the ridge, carrying the sound of 40 men straight up to whoever was waiting, and his stomach dropped because that was the first thing she'd said in the briefing, and it was already true. Pike, she said without turning her head, barely a whisper, get off the low line now, get to the rocks on the right. Carter. They're already looking at us. Her voice was flat, certain, terrifyingly calm. The sun's off the spur. We're lit up like a stage and they're in the dark. It's not if anymore. It's seconds. And that was the moment the eastern spur opened up. The machine gun came first exactly where she'd said it would be, and the sound of it rolled down into the low ground like the sky tearing in half. The first burst caught the point element flat-footed in the open, and 2 men went down before anyone had even registered what was happening, and then the whole world came apart at once. RPGs whooshed off the reverse slope, 2 of them 3, and the ground jumped and threw dirt and rock and fountains, and men were screaming, and the ordered column of 40 professionals dissolved in about 4 seconds into scattered clusters of men pressing themselves into a valley floor that offered them nothing to hide behind. It was a perfect ambush. It was exactly precisely down to the machine gun placement and the RPG angles, the ambush that a medic had drawn on a map 90 minutes earlier, while grown men chuckled at her. Jonah dove for the rocks on the right, the ones she'd told him to run for, and a burst chewed the ground where he'd been standing half a second before. He rolled behind cover with his heart trying to punch out of his chest, and he came up with his rifle, and he tried to find the machine gun, and he couldn't because the sun was in his eyes exactly the way she'd said it would be, and he understood in that instant with total clarity that they were losing. Not going to lose, losing right now. Contact eastern spur, Vickers was screaming into the radio somewhere in the chaos. Contact, we are pinned, we have wounded. His voice cracked, and Jonah had never heard that before, had never once heard Mason Vickers sound like a man who wasn't in control, and the sound of it was worse than the gunfire. Casualties, we have multiple casualties. We need... The machine gun walked a burst across the rocks near Vickers, and he stopped talking and pressed himself down, and the radio call just died there unfinished because there was nothing to say. There was no fixing this from the middle of the kill zone. He'd walked them into the funnel, and the funnel had closed, and now the senior chief of Firebase Anchor was doing the only thing the ground left him to do, which was lie in the dirt and pray. That was when the young operator, Remy, tried to run. He was pinned behind a low hump of earth that wasn't cover so much as the idea of cover, and the machine gunner was walking closer, and he panicked, and he broke, and he came up to sprint for the rocks. And Jonah watched it happen in slow motion and couldn't do anything about it because the second Remy stood up, he was a silhouette on the valley floor, and the gunner on the spur saw him plain as day. And then Evelyn was there. Jonah didn't even see her move. 1 second, she was flat behind a rock, and the next she had crossed 6 meters of open ground in a low, fast scramble that no medic should have been able to make. And she hit Remy at the knees and dropped him back into the dirt an instant before the burst that would have cut him in half, stitched the air where his chest had been. "Stay down," she said into his ear, calm as a woman reading a grocery list. "You run, you die. You stay, you live. Do you understand me, Remy? You stay with me." "They got Decker," Remy was babbling. "They got Decker. He's hit bad. I saw where. By the point up front, he's okay." She had already ripped open her bag. "You keep your head down and you hand me what I ask for. That's your whole job now. Can you do that?" He nodded wild-eyed, and something in her calm reached into his panic and pulled him back from the edge. And he did it. He held it together because she told him to. And that was the second time in 90 seconds that the bandage girl saved a life while the operators lay pinned in the dirt. Jonah found his voice and keyed his own radio. "This is Pike. I've got eyes on the rear element. Medic is up and working. We've got at least 4 wounded I can see." Another RPG hit, and the transmission dissolved into static and profanity. When it cleared, he could hear Vickers again, still pinned, still trying to command a fight he'd lost the shape of. "Pike, can you get to the spur? Can anyone flank the spur?" Jonah looked at the eastern spur, 300 meters of open uphill ground, with a machine gun raking every inch of it, and he keyed the radio and told the senior chief the truth. Negative, there's no approach. He's got the whole low ground locked. We move, we die." "Then what the hell do we do?" And Jonah Pike, lying behind a rock with the sun in his eyes and the world coming apart, thought of a finger of rock on the western side of the valley and a woman who had said, "I'll just need to pick one up." He turned his head and he looked for her. She was already gone. Not gone. He caught the flicker of her low and fast moving away from Remy, away from the wounded, in a direction that made no sense at all for a medic, because it was away from the men who needed her and toward the western edge of the valley, toward the rocks, toward the base of a finger of stone that jutted out over the valley floor with a clear line to the spur and the slope and the ridge, the tooth. "Carter!" Jonah screamed it into the radio and across the open air both at once. "Carter, where are you going? We've got wounded." She didn't answer him. She was crouched over a shape in the dirt, and Jonah's blood went cold as he realized the shape was a man, one of the point element, and the man wasn't moving, and beside the man was a rifle. Not a carbine, a rifle. Long-scoped, purpose-built for exactly one thing. The MK-11. The designated marksman's weapon, and the marksman it belonged to was face down in the low ground and past all need of it. Evelyn Carter picked it up. She picked it up the way a person picks up something they have held 10,000 times in another life. There was no fumbling, no hesitation, no unfamiliarity in her hands at all. She checked the weapon in one smooth motion, cleared it, felt its weight, and Jonah watched a transformation happen that he would try and fail to describe for the rest of his life. The medic was gone. The woman who folded bandages and checked on sentries and said yes, senior chief in a flat, quiet voice, was simply gone. And in her place was something he had no name for. Something still and cold and absolutely certain, and it moved toward the tooth with the rifle held low, and it did not look back. "Vickers," Jonah keyed the radio and his voice had changed and he heard it change. "Senior Chief, the medic just picked up Decker's MK-11 and she's moving to the high rock on the west side." There was a beat of static. "She's what?" Vickers' voice came back so loud it distorted. "Get her off it. That's a designated weapon. She has no idea how to pike. That is a medic with a sniper rifle. In the middle of a firefight, she's going to get herself killed or shoot one of us. Get her off that weapon. That's an order." "Senior Chief," Jonah said, and later he would think this was the bravest thing he ever did, braver than any shot he ever took. "With respect, shut up and watch." Because Evelyn Carter had reached the tooth. She went prone behind the finger of rock in one fluid motion, and she snugged the rifle into her shoulder, and she put her eye to the scope, and for one long moment she was completely still. Jonah, watching through his own optic across the valley, saw her do something that made the hair stand up on his arms. She wasn't hunting for the target. She wasn't searching. She turned her head and read the flag of dust drifting off the rocks near her position. And she glanced at the shimmer of mirage rising off the sun-warmed stone of the spur, and she moved her lips once, and Jonah knew without hearing it exactly what she was doing. She was doing the math. 41 days of wind logs. 12 days of studying this exact piece of rock. 3 readings a day of how the cold air sank in the morning and the warm air rose and how they collided over the valley floor. She wasn't guessing the wind. She already knew the wind. She'd known it before she ever set foot in the low ground. All she had to do now was confirm what she'd calculated for 12 straight days and adjust and press. The machine gun on the eastern spur was still hammering, still tearing the low ground apart, still the single thing keeping 40 men pinned and dying. Evelyn Carter breathed out and fired. The shot cracked out over the valley, one clean report, lost almost immediately in the din of the ambush, and for a half second nothing seemed to change, and then the machine gun on the eastern spur simply stopped. It didn't pause. It didn't shift. It stopped all at once, and forever the way a machine gun stops when the man behind it is no longer alive to work it, and a silence fell across the low ground so sudden and so total that Jonah could hear his own blood in his ears. Every man in the valley felt it. That gun had been the whole world for 90 seconds, the fixed point of their terror, and now it was gone, cut off mid-burst by a single shot from the western rocks, and 40 pinned men lifted their heads a fraction of an inch and dared for the first time to believe they might live. "She got it?" Jonah breathed into the radio. "Senior Chief, she got the gun. 1 shot." Vickers didn't answer. Vickers, 300 meters away, flat in the dirt where his own decisions had put him, had just watched a woman he'd called Bandage Girl that very morning do in 1 second what his entire team of operators had been unable to do at all. And whatever was going through Mason Vickers' mind in that moment, he did not have words for it, and so he said nothing, and he watched, because Evelyn wasn't finished. The RPG team on the reverse slope had heard the gun go quiet, and they popped up to see what had happened. One man rising with the launcher on his shoulder, and it was the last mistake he ever made. Jonah saw her shift the rifle 6 inches, saw the tiny stillness, saw her fire, and the man with the launcher folded, and the launcher tumbled down the slope, and his partner dove for cover and did not come back up. 2 shots, 2 threats erased, and now for the first time the shape of the battle began to bend. "She's controlling it," Jonah said, and he wasn't even talking on the radio anymore. He was just saying it out loud to himself, watching in something close to awe. My God, the doc is controlling the fight. And she was. That was the thing Jonah understood as he watched the thing that separated a good shooter from whatever Evelyn Carter was. She wasn't just killing targets. She was shaping the enemy's choices. Every time one of them moved to a better position, she was already looking at that position because she'd mapped every inch of this valley for 41 days, and she knew where a man would want to go before he knew it himself. She fired again and drove 2 riflemen off a rock they were trying to climb. She fired again and pinned a group trying to reposition on the slope. She was hurting them, funneling them, turning the whole ambush inside out, taking the funnel Vickers had walked into and folding it back on the men who'd built it. The enemy had set a perfect trap in the one place in the valley where everything lined up. They had not accounted for the fact that the one person in the valley who understood exactly why it was perfect was lying on the tooth with a rifle and a grudge and 41 days of preparation. All elements. This is Pike. Jonah keyed up, and now his voice had the steady command in it that Vickers had lost. The gun's down, the RPGs are down. We have a friendly marksman on the western rock giving us cover. Point element, you've got a window. Move your wounded to the rocks on the right. Go now, go, go! And they went. Men who'd been frozen in the dirt for 2 full minutes came up and grabbed their wounded and moved, and the enemy fire that should have cut them down as they crossed the open ground never came, because every time a shooter tried to line up on the moving men, a round from the tooth cracked past his head and put him back down. She was buying them the crossing. 1 shot at a time, she was holding the whole eastern side of the valley off the backs of running men. Jonah grabbed Remy and a wounded man named Foster and hauled them toward the rocks. And as he ran, half dragging Foster, he glanced up at the tooth, and he saw her working the rifle in that same unhurried rhythm. Breathe, calculate fire. Breathe, calculate fire. And he thought about the range officer who'd written statistically improbable in her file, and he thought about Vickers laughing in the briefing tent, and something in his chest twisted so hard he almost stumbled. They'd had this whole time. They'd had this, and they'd made her carry bandages. He got Foster and Remy into the rocks and dropped down, gasping, and that was when Vickers' voice came over the radio again, and it was different now. The panic was gone, but so was the arrogance. What was left was something raw. "Pike, who is that on the rock?" "You know who it is, Senior Chief." A long silence. The gunfire had thinned now to sporadic cracks as the enemy, leaderless and disorganized, and suddenly on the receiving end of precision fire they couldn't locate, began to lose their nerve. "Say it," Vickers said. "I want to hear you say it." "It's Carter," Jonah said. "It's the medic. It's the bandage girl. She's up on the rock she told you about in the briefing this morning in the ambush. She drew you a picture of 90 minutes ago using a rifle she picked up off a dead man because you wouldn't issue her one. And she's the only reason any of us are still breathing." He let it hang there. "How's that, Senior Chief, that specific enough for you?" Vickers didn't respond. There was nothing he could say, and they both knew it. Up on the tooth, Evelyn keyed the radio she'd taken off the dead marksman, along with his rifle, and her voice came across calm and clear, and every man on the net heard it. "All friendlies, this is Carter. Enemy is down to scattered small arms on the high ridge and the far slope. I count 6 shooters left, maybe 7. They've lost their heavy weapons and their command. If we push now, they break." A pause. "But there's a problem." "Talk to me, Carter," Jonah said. "There's one more shooter I haven't found." Her voice didn't waver, but it dropped, went harder, more focused. "There's a rifle on the far ridge, long gun, not a carbine. He fired twice at the start, and he's gone quiet. And a smart shooter only goes quiet for one reason. He's not panicking with the rest of them. He's hunting. He saw what I did to the machine gun, and now he's looking for the shooter who did it. A beat. He's looking for me, and I can't find him." And Jonah Pike, crouched in the rocks 300 meters away, felt the temperature of the whole battle change, because everything up to that moment had been Evelyn against men who didn't know she existed. This was different. This was one shooter against another. This was 2 people on 2 rocks in one valley, each trying to find the other before the other found them, and the loser did not walk away. "Can you see him?" Jonah asked. No. For the first time in 41 days, Jonah heard something in Evelyn Carter's voice that he'd never heard before, and it took him a second to place it because it was so out of character, and then he understood. It was respect. "He's good," she said quietly. "He's disciplined, he's not firing, he's not moving. He's letting me think I've won, so I'll get careless and show him where I am." A long pause. "That's exactly what my grandfather would have done. That's exactly what I would do. So what do? You keep the team moving and you keep them low, because if he can't find me, he'll take one of you instead, just to make me flinch." Her voice was tightening, narrowing to a point. "And I'm going to do the only thing I can do against a man this good. I'm going to make him move first." "How?" And Evelyn told him, and it was the kind of plan that only made sense coming from someone who understood the math of it all the way down to the bone, and it had terrified Jonah because the plan required her to do the one thing a sniper is never ever supposed to do. It required her to give away her position on purpose. "Carter, no." Jonah keyed up hard. "No, that's insane. You show yourself to a shooter that good, he ends it. That's the whole game. He ends it if he's faster than me," she said. "He won't be." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." And there it was again, that flat certainty. But underneath it now, Jonah could hear the whole weight of her life pressing down. The grandfather, the range officer, the file 41 days of bandages, all of it. "This is the exact thing they built me for and never let me be Pike. This is the target that matters. So I need you to do one thing for me, and I need you to not argue about it." "What?" "When I move, he's going to fire. And when he fires, his muzzle's going to flash, and his position's going to smoke, and for about 1 second, I'm going to know exactly where he is." Her voice was steady as stone. "But I'll be exposed and moving, and I won't have a good angle. You will. You're low in the valley on the eastern rocks. So when he fires at me, you call it. You call his position. You be my eyes for 1 second, and I'll do the rest." Jonah's mouth was dry. "You want to use yourself as bait." "I want you to spot for me," she said. Same thing my grandfather and his spotter did 100 times. He shoots you, call, I fire. One pass. That's all we get. If we're fast, he's dead. If we're slow, I am. A pause and then softer, almost gentle, the first fully human thing she'd said since she picked up the rifle. Can you do that for me, Jonah? Can you be my spotter? And Jonah Pike, who 11 years into an operator's career, had never once been asked to trust a medic with his life, found that he trusted this one with everything he had. Yeah, he said. Yeah, Carter, I've got you. Tell me when. Get your optic on the far ridge, the whole eastern face. Don't look away, don't blink, watch for the flash. He heard her shift on the rock, heard the creak of her settling behind the weapon. When I move, he'll take the shot. It'll come fast. You call the position off the flash and I'll swing to it. We don't get a second try. I'm on the ridge. I've got the whole face. I'm not looking away. Vickers! Her voice again, and now it was addressed to the man who'd shoved her in the dirt that morning, the man who'd stripped her from briefings and blocked her from the range, the man who'd laughed at her 90 minutes ago. You still on the net, Senior Chief? A pause. I'm here, Carter. When this is over, we're going to have a lot of wounded and not a lot of time. Decker's hit bad, Foster's bleeding, there will be more. So I need you to get your head right and be ready to be a leader again the second the shooting stops, because I'm going to be busybodying your men back together, and I'm going to need you to actually run this team while I do it. No malice in it, no triumph, just a medic giving her commander a job. Can you do that? And Mason Vickers, lying in the dirt of the valley, his pride had led them into having watched everything he believed about the world turned upside down in the space of 3 minutes, said the only thing there was to say. Yeah, he said, and his voice was rough. Yeah, Carter, I can do that. Good. A breath. Then here we go. Jonah watched the ridge. Watching. On me. And Evelyn Carter, who had spent 41 days making herself invisible, who had folded bandages and swallowed insults, and waited with a patience that bordered on the inhuman, for the day the world would be wrong about her, and it would cost them, gathered herself behind the rifle on the finger of rock she'd been studying for 12 days. Somewhere on the far ridge, 800 meters away, a disciplined man with a long gun waited in perfect stillness for her to make the one mistake he needed. She was about to give it to him on purpose. 3, she said. Jonah's eye pressed to the optic, the whole eastern face of the ridge, filling his vision, his heart slamming. 2. The valley had gone almost silent now, the scattered shooters gone to ground, the whole world holding its breath, and narrowing down to 2 rocks in 1 second of time. That hadn't happened yet. 1, and she moved. She rolled left out from behind the cover of the tooth, exposing her shoulder and her head and half her body to the far ridge for one deliberate, calculated instant. And she did the thing no sniper is ever supposed to do. And she did it on purpose, and the entire war held its breath. The shot came exactly when she said it would. 800 meters away, the disciplined man on the far ridge saw movement where he'd been patiently waiting for movement. And he was good. He was so good. And his finger took up the slack, and his rifle spoke, and a round split the air, a hand's width from where Evelyn Carter's head had been half a second before. She was already moving back the other way. She'd never intended to stay in that spot. She'd shown him a target and yanked it away. And the whole point had never been to survive his shot easily. The whole point was that he had to take it, because a shot has a flash, a shot has smoke, a shot has an origin. Got it! Jonah's voice cracked across the net, tight and fast and certain. Far ridge eastern faced the notch between the 2 big rocks. Quarter of the way down, there's smoke. Carter the notch. She was already swinging. Jonah watched it through his optic, and he would swear until the day he died that it was the single most impossible thing he ever saw a human being do. She came off her roll and she brought the rifle up and around, and she found the notch, the exact notch, before the enemy shooter's smoke had even finished dissipating. And she did not pause to search, she did not hunt. She trusted her spotter completely, and she put the crosshair where Jonah's voice had told her to put it. And now came the part that no spotter could help her with, the part that was hers alone, the part her grandfather had spent 11 years teaching a girl on his knee. 840 meters. She'd ranged it in the half second she was exposed, ranged it off the 2 big rocks she'd memorized from the fire base weeks ago. The wind between her rock and his was not 1 wind. It was 3. There was the wind at her muzzle drifting off the sun-warmed stone, gentle left to right. There was the wind in the middle of the valley, the collision zone, where the cold sinking air and the warm rising air met over the low ground and churned in ways that would push a bullet in one direction and then shove it back in another. And there was the wind at his position on the far ridge, higher colder, running the opposite way to the wind at her feet. A guesser would have read the flag at her own muzzle and held for that and missed by 3 feet. Evelyn Carter did not guess. She held for the whole flight of the bullet. She held for the layered air, the crosswind at the muzzle and the counter-rotation in the valley, and the thermal distortion rising off the rocks that she could see shimmering in her scope like heat off a summer road. She stacked all of it, every variable, every correction, the entire journey of a piece of metal across 840 meters of treacherous mountain air, and she did it in the space of a single held breath. And somewhere in the back of her mind was her grandfather's low, quiet voice saying the thing he always said. The math doesn't panic, Evie. The math is always there. She fired, and for one full second, the longest second of Jonah Pike's life, nothing happened. The bullet was in the air traveling, and there was nothing anyone could do but wait for it to arrive, and Jonah held his breath and stared through his optic at the notch in the far ridge and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Then the enemy's shooter's rifle tipped forward out of the notch, sliding loose from hands that no longer held it, and tumbled down the rock face and did not stop tumbling until it lay still on the slope below, and behind it there was no more movement in the notch. No more movement at all, forever. 840 meters. One shot, in a wind that would have humbled most men who wore the sniper tab as a career. Target down, Jonah said, and his voice broke on the second word, and he didn't care. Carter, target is down. You got him. You got him. The net was silent. Every man who'd heard the exchange, every man low in the rocks with the sun in his eyes, every wounded man clinging to consciousness had listened to the whole thing, and now they lay in a valley that had gone suddenly impossibly quiet, and they understood each of them in his own way that they had just heard something none of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. And then Vickers keyed the net, and his voice was thick. Carter, you still with us? There was a pause. And when she answered, Jonah immediately heard the thing wrong in her voice, the tightness that hadn't been there before. I'm here, Senior Chief. A breath and it caught. But I need somebody to know that I'm hit. Jonah's stomach dropped through the floor of the valley. Hit Carter, hit where, when? The last RPG, when it hit the reverse slope. Her voice was still level, still doing the thing it always did, but slower now, more deliberate, a person managing something. I took fragmentation. Right side. I didn't say anything because I still had a shooter to find and I couldn't afford to think about it. A pause. I've been bleeding for about 4 minutes. It's not arterial, but it's not nothing. And here was the thing that broke something open in every man on that net, the thing that Jonah would tell and retell for the rest of his life whenever anyone asked him about the medic. She had been hit. She had been bleeding for 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes, she had killed a machine gunner, destroyed an RPG team, herded a dozen enemy fighters into disorder, covered the movement of the entire patrol, spotted and then outdueled the best enemy sniper in the valley at 840 meters, and never once, not for a single second, let any of it show in her voice. She'd carried a piece of shrapnel in her side through the whole thing, because there was still a shooter to find, because the target mattered. Stay right there. Jonah was already up, already moving, scrambling out of the rocks toward the tooth. Don't you move. I'm coming to you. Stay down. Jonah. Her voice stopped him cold. Don't. There are still shooters on the high ridge. They're broken, but they're not gone. And if you cross that open ground, you'll be exactly what I was 10 seconds ago, a target on the valley floor. A breath. I can still work. Listen to me. I can still work. You're bleeding. And so are 4 other men, and one of them is worse than me. Her voice found its steel again. Decker took rounds to the abdomen. He's got minutes, not hours. Foster's leg is open. There's a man from the point element I haven't even gotten to. So here's what's going to happen, and everybody's going to do exactly what I say, because right now I'm the only person in this valley who knows how to keep those men alive. A pause. Senior Chief, this is your team, but this is my aid station now, and my aid station is the whole valley. You back me, understood? And Mason Vickers, who 12 hours earlier would sooner have died than take a tactical instruction from a medic, said, understood. It's your call, Carter. What do you need? What followed was a thing Jonah Pike had never seen and would never see again. Evelyn Carter, with a piece of steel in her side and her own blood soaking into the dirt of the tooth, ran the casualty collection point for a firefight without ever leaving the rifle. She wouldn't come down, not while shooters remained on the high ridge, because she understood better than any of them that her position on the rock was the only thing keeping the enemy pinned, and the moment she abandoned it, the pressure would come off, and the survivors would rally, and the crossing would become a killing ground again. So she stayed. She kept the rifle on the ridge, and every time a broken enemy fighter found his nerve and tried to move, she put a round near him and took his nerve away again, and in between, in the spaces between shots, she ran the medicine. Jonah, get to Decker first. He's the priority. Foster can wait. Foster's not going to bleed out in the next 10 minutes, Decker is. Her voice came steady over the net, and Jonah moved to Decker and dropped beside him, and Decker was gray and shaking, and Jonah had no idea what to do. Talk to me, what am I looking at, she said. Abdomen low, right? It's bad. Carter, there's a lot of blood. Is it pumping or is it welling? Jonah looked. Welling, steady, not pumping. Okay, that's good. That means it's not the big artery that gives us time. Listen to me carefully. And she talked him through it step by step, a man who'd never done more than slap a field dressing on a scrape, and she made him a surgeon for 90 seconds with nothing but her voice telling him where to pack and how hard to press and what to watch for. And all the while, Jonah could hear her breathing getting shorter, and he knew she was working on herself between instructions one-handed, keeping the other hand on the rifle. Pressure hard, both hands, lean your whole weight into it. He's going to scream. Let him scream. A man who screams is a man who's still got blood pressure. It's the quiet ones you lose. Decker screamed. Jonah leaned into it. And Decker, who should have died in that valley, did not die. Remy, her voice shifted to the young operator. You still with me? I'm here, Doc. What do you need? Foster's leg. You're closest. There's a tourniquet in the pouch on Foster's own kit left shoulder red pull tab. You can't miss it. High and tight above the wound, and you crank it until the bleeding stops, and then you crank it 2 more turns, and you don't stop. When he tells you to stop, because he's going to tell you to stop. Go. And Remy, the same Remy who'd panicked and tried to run an hour ago, the same Remy she'd tackled into the dirt and told you stay with me, did it hands shaking, and got the tourniquet on and stopped the bleeding and looked up in astonishment at what his own hands had done. She'd done that too. She'd taken a boy who broke under fire and in the middle of the worst day of his life, turned him into someone who could save another man's life. That was a kind of shooting too, Jonah thought. That was hitting a target nobody else could see. Piece by piece, man by man, she pulled the patrol back from the edge. She never raised her voice. She never lost the thread. She held the ridge with the rifle, and she held the wounded together with her words, and slowly the balance of the whole valley tilted until the surviving enemy fighters, leaderless and terrified of a shooter they still could not locate, began to slip away over the back of the high ridge 1 and 2 at a time, until there was no one left to shoot at and the guns fell silent for good. And still wouldn't come off the rock. Carter, it's over. Jonah stood in the open now, and no rounds came, and he knew it was true. They're gone. The ridge is clear. You can stand down. Come down off there. Let me look at you. Not yet. Her voice was fainter now, and Jonah's chest tightened at the sound of it. I count the wounded first. Decker's stabilized. He's stabilized, breathing. You saved him. Foster's tourniquet's holding. It's holding. Remy did it right. The point man, the one I couldn't get to. Somebody check him. I need a status. Carter. Vickers' voice, this time gentle in a way Jonah had never once heard from him. Everybody's accounted for. Everybody who was alive an hour ago is still alive right now. Every single one, because of you. A pause, and the big man's voice went rough. Now come down off that rock before you bleed out being stubborn, and let your team take care of you for once. That's an order. Maybe the first order I've given all day that's worth a damn. And there was a long silence on the net. And then finally, Evelyn Carter let go of the rifle. Jonah watched her rise from the tooth, slow and careful. One hand pressed to her right side, and she came down off the rock she'd been studying for 12 days. And she crossed the open valley floor that she'd known would be a killing ground and had made safe with her own hands, and she walked toward her wounded team, and she was limping. And there was blood down her whole right side, and she was still, even now, even bleeding, scanning each man as she reached him, checking, assessing, working. Vickers met her halfway. The senior chief of Firebase Anchor, the man who'd shoved her into the dirt that morning and called her bandage girl, stood in front of her with his weapon slung and his hands empty, and he looked at her and he tried to find words, and for a long moment, there were no words in him at all. "Carter," he finally managed, "this morning, in the briefing, you told me exactly where. The gun, the RPEs, the shooter, all of it. You drew me the whole thing and I—" He stopped, swallowed. "I laughed at you. I put you at the back of the column. I've been wrong about you since the day you got here, and today it almost killed all of us, and the only reason it didn't is you." His voice cracked completely. "I was wrong about you. I have never been so wrong about anything in my life." And Evelyn Carter, bleeding, exhausted, one hand pressed to her side, looked at the man who'd finally seen her. And she didn't gloat. She didn't say, "I told you so," though God knew she'd earned it 100 times over. She didn't ask for an apology or a commendation or a single word of the recognition she'd been denied her whole career. She looked at Mason Vickers and past him at Decker Gray and breathing on the ground, and at Foster with his tourniquet, and at Remy standing there with a dead man's blood on his hands and tears in his eyes. And she said the only thing that mattered to her, the thing that had always mattered to her, the thing that made her who she was. "I need somebody to hold pressure on Decker while I get a needle in him," she said, already moving toward the wounded man, already lowering herself painfully to her knees beside him. "And then somebody needs to look at Foster's leg again. I want to check that tourniquet time." She was opening her bag with red-stained hands. "And I'm going to need stitches in my side at some point, but that can wait. That can wait. Decker can't." Vickers stared at her. "Carter, you're hit. Let me get another medic on the wounded. You need to—" "I am the medic, Senior Chief." She said it without looking up, threading a line into Decker's arm with hands that did not shake even now. "I've been the medic this whole time. That never changed." A breath. "The only thing that changed today is that you finally believed me about the other part." And she went back to work. Jonah Pike stood in the middle of that valley and watched a woman with a piece of steel in her side kneel in the bloody dirt and pull one more man back from death. And he thought about the range officer who'd written statistically improbable. And he thought about all the doors that had been closed in the face of a girl who could outshoot every man in her class. And he thought about 41 days of bandages and swallowed insults and quiet, patient, terrible waiting. She was never support personnel. He understood that, now understood it all the way down. That was the lie they'd all believed, the lie stamped in her file and repeated in the chow tent and shouted at her that very morning with rounds cracking overhead. She was never the bandage girl. She was the most dangerous person on that mountain, and she had been the entire time, and they had walked past her for 41 days without ever once seeing what was standing right in front of them. And the worst part, the part that would keep Jonah up at night for years, was how close it had come. How close they'd come to walking into that valley and dying in it, all of them 40 men, in the low ground, because the one person who could see it coming had a rank and a rang and a gender that told everyone in charge she wasn't worth listening to. She told them. She told them exactly where and exactly how and exactly why. And they'd laughed at the bandage girl. Now the bandage girl knelt in the dirt with a needle in her steady hands, keeping a dying man's heart beating, refusing to tend her own wound until every one of theirs was closed, and around her stood a team of hardened operators who would never again, as long as they lived, mistake quiet for weak or a med bag for the whole of a person or restraint for the absence of a weapon. Decker's breathing steadied under her hands. His color started to come back. And Evelyn Carter allowed herself for just one moment, one single moment in 41 days to close her eyes. Not in triumph, in something quieter and deeper than triumph. In the profound, bone-deep relief of a person who had finally, after a lifetime of being told to run, been allowed to stand exactly where she'd always known she belonged. Then she opened her eyes and pressed her palm harder against Decker's wound and got back to the only thing she had ever truly cared about, which was keeping the people around her alive. The wind through the valley shifted, cold air sinking as the sun crossed its peak, exactly as her logbook had predicted it would 41 days ago and every day since. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet as a curtain, moving her grandfather's voice said the last thing he'd ever taught her, the thing underneath all the shooting and all the math and all the waiting. You don't do it for the credit, Evie. You do it because you can, and because they can't, and because somebody has to. She had done it. And for the first time in her life, every person around her finally knew exactly who she was. The medevac birds came in 40 minutes later, two of them dropping into the valley the moment the pilots believed it was cold, and the whole time Evelyn Carter never stopped working. She had triaged the wounded in the order they needed her, not the order that would have been easiest. And by the time the first bird's rotor wash was flattening the dust around them, she had Decker stable enough to go to fly and Foster's legs secured, and the point man, whose name was Alvarez, propped up and breathing on his own after she'd sealed a sucking chest wound with nothing but a plastic wrapper and the flat of her own bloody hand. Jonah watched her load Decker onto the bird herself, refusing to let anyone else do it, riding the litter alongside him and shouting his status to the flight medic over the roar. And only when Decker was strapped in and IV'd and away did she step back and let the bird lift off, and only then, watching it climb out of the valley, did Jonah see her sway on her feet. "Carter," he caught her elbow, "you're on the next bird." "Alvarez goes on the next bird," his lung. "Alvarez is loaded and stable, and you did that? You're going with him." Jonah's grip tightened, gentle but immovable. "Look at me. Look at your side. You've been bleeding for over an hour, and you've been running on pure stubborn, and it's about to run out. You get on that bird, or I carry you onto it, and I will. I swear to God, I will pick you up and carry you like a sack of feed in front of the whole team. So pick which way this goes." She looked at him, and something in her, some final tautness that had been holding her upright through the whole thing, eased by a fraction, and she almost smiled. "You'd really do that," she said, in a heartbeat. "Vickers would love that." "Vickers," said Vickers, appearing at Jonah's shoulder, "would carry you onto the bird himself. Get on the aircraft, Carter." "That's an order, and this one I actually mean." He paused, and his hard face did something complicated. "Please." The word "please" coming from Mason Vickers was so foreign that it did what no order could have done. Evelyn Carter let them walk her to the second bird, and she let the flight medic take her weight. And as they lifted off, she pressed her face to the window and watched Firebase anchor shrink below her, the low ground and the eastern spur, and the finger of rock she'd called the Tooth, the whole valley she'd carried in her head for 41 days. And then it was gone behind the mountains, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the resupply bird, she let herself stop. She woke up in a field hospital 200 kilometers away, with 23 stitches in her side, and a piece of shrapnel in a small plastic dish on the table beside her bed, and Jonah Pike asleep in a chair he had no business being in. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, and her voice came out cracked. Jonah jerked awake. "You're not supposed to talk yet. Doc said you'd be under till tonight. I've been shot at for 41 days, Pike. I don't sleep on other people's schedules." She tried to sit up. Wins thought better of it. "How's Decker?" "Alive. Surgery went long, but he's alive. They're saying he'll keep the kidney." Jonah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Foster's leg is going to be a long road, but he's keeping it. Alvarez is breathing on his own. Everybody you pulled out of that valley is still on the right side of the grass, Carter. Every single one." He said it slowly because he wanted her to hear it. "You did that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." And it was the same flat good she'd said in the valley. And Jonah understood that this was simply how she received the news that she'd saved 4 lives, the same way another person might receive the news that the mail had come. And that was the moment Jonah decided he was going to do something about it. He didn't tell her not then, but sitting in that hard chair in that field hospital, watching her lie there having just done the most extraordinary thing he'd seen in 11 years of war, and receiving it like it was nothing like it was Tuesday, something hardened in him. Because he knew how this went. He'd seen it before, though never quite like this. He knew that a valley full of men would tell the story around 100 fires for the rest of their lives, and he knew that not one word of it would make it into a single official document, because the official documents would have a problem. And the problem was that everything Evelyn Carter had done that day, she had done in direct violation of orders, with a weapon she wasn't authorized to carry, in a role she wasn't cleared for, after her commander had denied her request to qualify not 12 hours before. The Navy did not have a box for what she'd done, and things that don't fit in a box have a way of disappearing. "Carter," he said, the after-action report. Her eyes came open. "What about it?" "Somebody's gonna have to write down what happened in that valley, and whoever writes it down is gonna have a real interesting choice to make." He held her gaze. Because the true version has a medic disobeying a direct order, taking a designated weapon off a casualty, engaging the enemy without authorization, and single-handedly turning a failed ambush into a rout at 840 meters. And the true version makes a senior chief look like a man who marched his team into a kill zone he'd been warned about 90 minutes earlier by the exact person who then had to save him from it. He let that sit. One of those versions is a medal. The other one is a court-martial. Same day, same woman, depends entirely on who tells it and how. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "You think they'll bury it?" she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I think," Jonah said carefully, "that there are a lot of people who would find it very convenient if the story of that valley was that a SEAL element took an ambush, fought bravely, and extracted with casualties. Clean, simple. No awkward questions about a medic who did something the whole institution says can't happen." He rubbed his face. "And I think you're exactly the kind of person who'd let them, because you don't care about the credit and you never have, and they know it, and they'll count on it." She didn't deny it. "So here's what I need to know before I do anything," Jonah said. "Do you want the truth told, Carter? Because I'll tell it. I was your spotter. I saw the whole thing. I'll put my name on it and I'll say every word of it to anyone who asks all the way up. But it's your story and it's your life, and if you tell me to let it lie, I'll respect that. So, what do you want?" And Evelyn Carter looked at the ceiling of that field hospital for a long time, and Jonah watched her wrestle with something, and when she finally spoke, what came out wasn't what he expected at all. "You know what my grandfather told me the day the range officer wrote me up the second time," she said. "I called him crying. I was 17. I just outshot the whole class again and again. They had written it down as a fluke, and I told him I was done. I was quitting. There was no point. And he was quiet for a long time on the phone. And then he said, 'Evie, the world is full of people who are going to decide what you are before you ever open your mouth, and you cannot change most of them, and you will break yourself trying.'" She turned her head to look at Jonah. And then he said, "So don't shoot for them, shoot for the day it matters, because one day it'll matter, and on that day, nobody will care what your file says. They'll only care whether the target went down. And that day will be worth all the other days put together." She was quiet. "That valley was the day Pike," she said. "That was the day it mattered. And Decker's alive. Foster's got his leg. Alvarez is breathing. 40 men are going home who weren't going to." Her voice was steady. "My grandfather was right. That was worth all the other days. And I don't need a piece of paper to tell me, because I already know it, and the men in that valley already know it, and that's enough. That's actually enough. I'm not chasing the paper." Jonah nodded slowly, and then he leaned forward. "Okay," he said, "I hear you, and I respect it, I do. But I'm going to push back on one thing, and then I'll drop it if you tell me to." He held her eyes. "You're right that you don't need the paper. But this isn't just about you anymore, and I think you know that." He let it land. "There's going to be another Evelyn Carter. There's a girl at some range right now, shooting scores they're going to write down as statistically improbable, and there's going to be 100 more after her. And every one of them is going to hit the same wall you hit and get handed the same bag of bandages and get told the same thing. And the only way that wall ever comes down is if somebody one time forces the institution to write down in black and white that it happened, that a woman they called a bandage girl was the best shooter on the mountain and they almost died because they couldn't see it." He sat back. "You letting them bury this doesn't just cost you a medal, Carter. It costs her, whoever she is. It tells them they can keep doing it and it'll keep working, because even when they're wrong in the most spectacular way possible, the woman who proves it will stay quiet and let it slide because she's too decent to make a fuss." His voice dropped. "So don't do it for the credit. You're right, the credit doesn't matter. Do it for her. Make them write it down." And Evelyn Carter, who had been unmovable through insults and dismissals and a firefight and a piece of shrapnel in her side, went very still. Because he'd found it. The one target that mattered more than the mission. The one thing her grandfather's philosophy couldn't wave away. She'd built her whole piece around not needing recognition for herself, and Jonah had just quietly, devastatingly taken away her ability to hide behind that, because this wasn't about herself anymore. And they both knew she couldn't say no to that. "That's a low blow, Pike," she said quietly. "Yeah," he agreed, It's the truest thing I've ever said, and it's a low blow. Both things are true. She closed her eyes, opened them. Write it down, she said. All of it. The truth, every word, and I'll sign it. Jonah exhaled. Okay. And Pike. Her voice stopped him as he stood. It's not going to be clean. The second that report goes up, somebody's going to have a problem because the truth makes somebody look very, very bad, and people who look bad don't lie down quietly. You understand that. You're picking a fight. I know. With people way above your pay grade. I know that too. Jonah's jaw set. I was your spotter in that valley, Carter. I called the ridge and you trusted me, and we killed a man who was one trigger pull from killing you. That kind of thing changes a guy's math about which fights are worth having. He almost smiled. Turns out I've got a little of your grandfather in me. This is the day it matters, so I'm going to shoot for it. He wrote the report that night. He wrote it plain and true and without a single word of embellishment because the truth needed no embellishment. And because embellishment was the first thing a hostile reviewer would attack. He wrote the timeline exactly. 0800 patrol departs on the original route over the objection of the attached medic, who had provided a detailed and, as it turned out, completely accurate prediction of the ambush during the pre-mission brief. 0840 contact. He wrote down every minute of it. The machine gun, the RPGs, the moment the command structure failed. And then he wrote down what Evelyn Carter did, one shot at a time, and he wrote down that she did it after her request to qualify beyond the pistol had been denied that very morning, and he wrote down that she'd been wounded early and concealed it in order to keep fighting, and he wrote down the range to the enemy's sniper, 840 meters. In the wind conditions he'd personally observed, and he wrote down that he had served as her spotter and would attest to every word under oath. And then, because he knew exactly how these things died, he did the thing that would turn out to matter most of all. He made copies. He made 3 copies of the report and the range data and the terrain analysis Carter had presented in the brief, which he'd photographed off the map before they'd stepped off. And he gave 1 copy to the flight medic who'd flown Decker out and 1 copy to a chief he trusted at the battalion aid station. And he kept 1 himself, and he did all of it before he submitted the official version up his chain of command. Because Jonah Pike had been in long enough to know that the first thing that happens to an inconvenient truth is that the original gets lost. And the second thing that happens is that everyone who remembers it gets told very politely to forget. He submitted the report at 2200 hours. By 0600 the next morning, the phone call started. The first call came to Vickers, and Jonah wasn't in the room for it, but he heard about it afterward. Because you could hear the shape of a thing like that, even through a closed door. A voice from higher up, a voice that did not want this report to exist, asking the senior chief a series of leading questions designed to give him an exit. Wasn't it true that in the chaos it was hard to be certain who fired what shots? Wasn't it possible the medic had simply provided fire support in extremis, the way any service member might in a life or death situation, rather than, as the report seemed to suggest, single-handedly turning the battle wasn't the 840-meter shot? Perhaps an exaggeration born of adrenaline and gratitude. Didn't the senior chief agree that the cleanest and most accurate characterization was simply that a well-trained SEAL element had prevailed under fire? They were handing him the clean version on a silver platter. They were giving Mason Vickers the chance to make the whole awkward thing go away, and in doing so to erase the part of the story where he'd marched his men into a kill zone he'd been warned about. All he had to do was agree. All he had to do was let the truth blur into something comfortable. And this was the moment Jonah would say later that he finally understood he'd been wrong about Mason Vickers too. Not wrong the way he'd been wrong about Carter, but wrong all the same, because Vickers said no. Jonah got the story from a comms specialist who'd been in the outer office, and the way she told it, Vickers had listened to the whole careful pitch in silence. And then he'd said, and the comms specialist swore she'd never forget it, "Sir, I'm going to stop you there. I know what you're offering me, and I know why, and I want it on the record that I'm turning it down." A pause. "I marched 40 men into that valley after the medic told me exactly where the ambush was, down to the machine gun placement. I've got it in my own brief notes. I ignored her because she was a woman with a med bag, and I'd already decided what she was. And then she saved every one of us wounded after I told her that morning she couldn't even qualify for a rifle. That's the truth. Pike's report is accurate in every particular. And if the Navy wants to bury it to save me some embarrassment, then the Navy can find itself another senior chief. Because I'm not spending the rest of my career knowing I let them erase the woman who kept my whole team alive. Another pause. With respect, sir, I've already been wrong about her once. I'm not going to be wrong about her twice. The line apparently had gone very quiet. When Jonah heard it, he had to step outside for a minute. He stood in the cold with his hands on his knees, and he thought about a lot of things, and one of the things he thought about was how you never really know what a man is made of until the ground gives way under him, and you see what he grabs for on the way down. Vickers had grabbed for the truth. It had cost him something to grab for it. He'd done it anyway. Jonah went and found him. Heard about the call, Jonah said. Vickers looked up from the report he was reading, his own copy, Jonah's words, and his face was tired in a way that went past sleep. You made copies, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost admiring. That's why they couldn't just make it disappear. You made copies before you even submitted it. 3 of them, Jonah said. Figured somebody'd try. Smart. Vickers set the report down. You know they're not done. That was the polite version. When polite doesn't work, they get creative. They'll go after her qualifications, her fitness reports. They'll dig for anything that lets them say she was unstable or unreliable or that the whole thing was a fluke. They'll do to this report what that range officer did to her scores. His jaw worked. Statistically improbable. Testing irregularity. They'll find their own version of those words. Then we don't let them, Jonah said. We. Vickers almost smiled. You and me, an operator and a senior chief going to war with our own chain of command over a medic. He shook his head slowly. 12 hours ago, I'd have told you that you'd lost your mind. And now, Vickers was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and he picked up the report and something settled in his face, some final decision clicking into place. Now, he said, I've got a piece of paper to go defend and a phone call to make. That's going to end a couple of friendships I've had for 20 years. He looked at Jonah. Where is she? Field hospital, 23 stitches, awake and ornery. Good. Vickers moved toward the door. Because whatever happens next, whatever they throw at this, she needs to hear one thing from me directly, and I've been putting it off because I'm a coward about exactly one kind of conversation, and it's this kind. He stopped in the doorway. You coming? You're in this now, Pike, all the way in. No going back after this. Jonah followed him out into the cold gray morning, and the two of them walked toward the field hospital together, an operator and the senior chief who'd spent months treating the woman between them like furniture, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left to say that wasn't going to get said in the room ahead. They found her sitting up in the hospital bed, the piece of shrapnel still in its little dish beside her, and she watched them come in, two of them together, and something flickered across her face because a medic knows what it means when 2 men walk into your room wearing those expressions. Who died? She said. Nobody died, Jonah said. Everybody you touched is still breathing. I told you that. Then why do you both look like that? Vickers pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down heavily, and he held the report in his hands, and for a moment the hard man couldn't find the beginning of it. Carter, he said finally, I came to tell you 3 things, and I'm going to say all 3 before I lose my nerve, so let me get through it. He took a breath. The first thing is that they're going to try to bury what you did. Somebody up the chain already called this morning and offered me a clean way to make it go away, a version where the team just fought bravely, and you were never really the reason we lived. And they offered it to me because the true version makes me look like exactly the kind of fool I was. He looked her dead in the eye. I turned it down. The report Pike wrote is the truth, and it's staying the truth, and I put my name behind every word of it this morning, and it's probably going to cost me. I want you to know I did that. Not for you to thank me. Just so you know that when it mattered, I told the truth about you, even though the truth about you is also the truth about me. And the truth about me is ugly. Evelyn said nothing. She was watching him with those still, calm eyes. The second thing, Vickers went on, and his voice roughened, is that I'm sorry, and I know sorry is cheap, and I know you've heard sorry from men like me your whole career, and it never came to anything. But I'm going to say it anyway because you're owed it, and because I'll be a smaller man than I already am if I don't. I looked at you for 41 days and I saw a bandage girl, and I never once looked hard enough to see what Pike saw in 2 weeks, which is a person I should have been listening to from the first day. That morning in the brief, you handed me my whole team's lives and I laughed at you. I'll carry that. I should carry that. He swallowed. I'm sorry, Evelyn, for all of it. The room was very quiet. And the third thing, Vickers said, and now his voice was steadier because the third thing was easier. The third thing was a decision instead of a confession. Is that I'm in this fight with you now, whether you want me or not. They're going to come after your record, your scores, your stability, anything they can use to make you disappear. And Pike and I are going to stand in front of that. I don't know if we'll win. We're two guys against an institution that really doesn't want this story to be true. He set the report down on the bed beside her. But you told Pike something in this room yesterday, he told me. You said your grandfather taught you to shoot for the day it matters. Well, Carter, I never had a grandfather teach me anything that good. But I'm 60 hours late learning it, and I'm learning it now. This is the day it matters, and I'm not going to be the man who looked away twice. And Evelyn Carter, who had not cried in that valley, who had not cried through 23 stitches, who had received the news of 4 saved lives like it was the weather, looked at the report on the bed beside her, at Jonah's plain true words about what she'd done, at the 2 men who'd walked into her room ready to burn their own careers down to make the world write it down. And her eyes for just a moment went bright. She didn't let it fall. She was Evelyn Carter. She blinked it back, and she picked up the report, and she read Jonah's words about the woman on the tooth at 840 meters. And when she'd read it all the way through, she set it down, and she looked at the 2 of them, and when she spoke, her voice was almost steady. My grandfather used to say something else, she said. He said the hardest shot in the world isn't the long one. It's the one you take when you know it's going to cost you, and you take it anyway because it's the right shot. She looked from Jonah to Vickers and back. You 2 just took the hardest shot there is, and you didn't have to. And you did it for a woman you've known for 41 days, one of which you spent shoving her in the dirt. Yeah, well, Vickers said gruffly. Turns out that woman's the best shot on the mountain. Seemed like a good idea to start listening to her. And for the first time in 41 days in that field hospital with a fight ahead of them that none of them was sure they could win, Evelyn Carter smiled a real smile, and it changed her whole face. And both men saw in that instant the girl who'd sat on her grandfather's knee, learning to read a curtain in the wind long before the world had ever told her what she was allowed to be. All right, she said, and picked the report back up, and there was steel in her voice again, but a different kind, now a kind with 2 other people standing inside it. Then let's do it right. Sit down, both of you. If we're going to win this, they're going to attack the range numbers first, and I know exactly how because I've watched them do it to my scores twice before. So here's what they're going to say, and here's exactly how we prove them wrong. And the 2 men pulled their chairs close, and the medic they'd all been so wrong about started laying out the fight ahead. One calculated step at a time, the way her grandfather had taught her, the way she did everything. And outside the window, the wind came down off the mountains cold and clean, and for the first time, it was blowing at their backs. They came for the range numbers first, exactly as she'd said they would. It took 9 days. 9 days during which Evelyn healed and Jonah worked the phones and Vickers made the calls that ended his old friendships. And then on the 10th day, the review board convened, and the first thing out of the reviewing officer's mouth was the thing Evelyn had predicted almost word for word in that hospital room. His name was Captain Roland Hale, and he had flown in from a command 2 levels above anything Firebase Anchor had ever answered to. And that fact alone told Jonah everything he needed to know about how badly certain people wanted this to go away. You didn't send an 06 to review a firefight. You sent an 06 to make a problem stop being a problem. Halo sat at the head of a folding table in a plywood-walled room with Evelyn and Jonah and Vickers on one side and a legal officer and a note-taker on the other. And he opened a folder and he looked at the top page for a long moment, and then he looked at Evelyn Carter with an expression of what he probably believed was kindness. Petty Officer Carter, he said, before we go any further, I want you to understand that no one is questioning your courage. What happened in that valley was a terrifying situation, and you acted to save lives, and that's commendable. Genuinely. He turned a page. But I've been doing this a long time, and part of my job is to make sure the record reflects what actually happened, not what people in the grip of extreme stress believed happened. And I have some concerns about the technical claims in this report. He tapped the page. This 840-meter engagement of an enemy sniper in layered mountain wind from an improvised position with a weapon you'd never fired by a service member whose only rifle qualification on record is a basic marksmanship course she scored. He checked the file, adequately on. Do you understand why that gives a reviewing officer pause? And here it was, the move. Statistically improbable. Testing irregularity. A different man, different words, same knife. Evelyn didn't flinch. I understand completely, sir, she said. You're about to tell me it's not possible, and therefore it didn't happen the way the report says, and therefore the report should be corrected to something more believable. And I understand why, because a man in your position has to protect the integrity of the record, and an impossible claim in the record is a threat to that integrity. She folded her hands on the table. So before you say it, sir, may I ask you one question, just one? And then you can proceed however you like. Hale blinked. He hadn't expected that. Go ahead. You said my only qualification on record is a basic course I scored adequately on. Her voice was calm, level, the voice Jonah had heard direct a battlefield. Sir, do you have my range scorecards from that qualification in that folder? Not the summary, the actual scorecards, the shot by shot. Hale frown flipped through the folder. I have the summary result. Qualified, marksman. Yes, sir, marksman, the lowest of the 3 qualification levels. Evelyn nodded. Now here's my question. If you'll pull the actual scorecards, which are in the range archive, if anyone bothered to request them, you'll find something interesting. You'll find that I shot expert scores on the actual targets, every string, and you'll find a handwritten note from the range officer stating that my scores were, and I'm quoting from memory, because I read it enough times to memorize it, statistically improbable and likely the result of a testing irregularity, and that I was therefore recorded as marksman pending a retest. She let that sit, and you'll find that I was retested, and you'll find that I shot expert again, and you'll find a second note calling it a lucky day, and the record left at marksman. She met his eyes. So my question, sir, is this. When you look at my file and see marksman, are you looking at how I actually shot, or are you looking at what a range officer decided to write down because he didn't believe what he saw with his own eyes? The room went very quiet. Captain Hale looked at the summary in his hand at the single word marksman, and Jonah watched a crack open in the man's certainty, small but real, because Evelyn had done the one thing that could not be ignored. She hadn't argued that the valley shot was possible. She'd shown him that the very file he was using to prove it impossible had already lied to him once in writing about the exact same thing. I don't have the shot-by-shot cards, Hale admitted slowly. No, sir? Because nobody requested them because the summary said marksman and marksman is a believable, comfortable number for a woman with a med bag. Evelyn's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I'd respectfully request that this board obtain them before it decides that what I did in the valley was too good to be true. Because there is a documented pattern, sir, in my own official file of exactly one thing. Not of me being unable to shoot. Of the institution being unable to believe it when I do. Jonah wanted to stand up and cheer. He didn't. He sat perfectly still and watched a 9-day fight turn on a single question, and he thought she planned this. She planned this in the hospital. She knew they'd come at the numbers, and she knew the numbers were her strongest ground because the record had already convicted itself. Hale set the folder down. The board will obtain the original scorecards, he said, and to the note-taker, log that request as a formal action item. Priority. But he wasn't done, and neither were the people who'd sent him, and the next attack came from a different direction entirely, and it was uglier. Let's set the marksmanship question aside pending the records, Hale said, and his tone had shifted, cooled. There's a second issue, and frankly, it's the more serious one. Petty Officer Carter, regardless of your skill, the fact remains that you took a weapon you were not authorized to use, engaged the enemy in a role you were not cleared for, and did so after your commanding officer had specifically denied you rifle qualification that same morning. In doing so, you disobeyed a direct order and operated outside the scope of your rate and your authorization. He folded his hands. Now, some might call what you did heroic, but the military does not run on heroics. It runs on order and authorization and the chain of command, and the reason it does is that the day we start celebrating service members who ignore their orders and grab weapons they're not cleared for is the day we lose the thing that makes us a military instead of an armed mob. He looked at her steadily. So even granting everything you've said, there is a legitimate question here about whether the correct response to your actions is a commendation or a disciplinary proceeding. Do you understand the position that puts this board in? And this Jonah realized with a cold drop in his stomach was the real trap. This was the one Evelyn couldn't outcalculate with a scorecard because it wasn't about the numbers. It was about the rules, and by the rules, cold and literal, they had her. She had disobeyed. She had taken an unauthorized weapon. Every word of it was true, and the beauty of it, from the perspective of the people who wanted her gone, was that the truer her heroism, the truer her insubordination, because they were the same act. The clean version would have made her a footnote. But if the board accepted the true version was also a court-martial waiting to happen. They'd built a box where her greatest moment and her downfall were the same shape. Evelyn opened her mouth to answer, and Jonah saw for the first time in all of this that she didn't have it ready, that this one had reached past her preparation, and in that half-second of silence, someone else spoke. It was Vickers. Sir Mason Vickers said, "I'd like to answer that one, because it's my order she disobeyed, and it's my authorization she operated outside of. So it seems to me I'm the man who ought to speak to it." Hale turned. "Senior Chief, you're here as a witness, not—" "I understand, sir. I'll be brief." Vickers leaned forward, and his voice was rough and low and absolutely certain. "You said the military runs on order and authorization and the chain of command, and you're right, sir, it does. And I was the chain of command in that valley. I was the authorization. And here's the thing I've had 9 days to think about, and I need this board to hear." He paused. "My order was wrong, not just tactically wrong, though it was that. It was wrong in the way that matters most, which is that I gave it for the wrong reason. I denied that woman rifle qualification, and I routed my patrol into that valley over her objection, not because of any tactical judgment. I did it because I'd looked at her and decided what she was worth before she ever opened her mouth. That's not order. That's not authorization. That's prejudice wearing the uniform of authority." He let it land. "So when you ask whether the correct response to what she did is a commendation or a disciplinary proceeding, I'd ask the board to consider a third possibility, which is that a service member's duty is not to obey wrong orders. It's to accomplish the mission and protect the force. And when her commander's orders were actively getting the force killed, she did exactly what she was supposed to do. She protected the force, from the enemy and from me." Hale's jaw tightened. "Senior Chief, you're describing a very dangerous principle. If every subordinate gets to decide which orders are wrong— With respect, sir, I'm not describing a principle. I'm describing a fact. There was a machine gun killing my men in a command structure that had collapsed, and one person in that valley had the skill and the position to stop it, and she did, and 40 men are alive because she did." Vickers didn't blink. "You want to call that a disciplinary problem, sir? You go right ahead. But you're going to have to explain to Decker, who's got one kidney now instead of a body bag, why the woman who saved his life should be punished for it. And you're going to have to explain it to me because I gave the order that would have killed him, and I'm sitting here telling you under oath that thank God she didn't obey it." The room was silent for a long moment, and then Jonah spoke because he'd promised her he was all the way in, and all the way in meant not letting Vickers carry it alone. "Sir, Petty Officer Pike, I was her spotter." Hale turned to him. "I want to add one thing to what the senior chief said, and it's a small thing, but I think it matters." He took a breath. "The board keeps framing this as Carter deciding to disobey. She didn't decide to disobey. She never argued with a single order the whole time I knew her. She requested qualification through proper channels repeatedly and was denied. She raised the ambush risk in the brief through proper channels and was overruled. She did everything by the book, sir. Right up until the moment the book got 40 men pinned in a kill zone with a machine gun cutting them apart. And then she did the only thing left that could save them." He met Hale's eyes. "That's not a service member who disregards authority. That's a service member who exhausted every proper channel, was denied at everyone, and acted only when there was no channel left and men were dying. If you're looking for the failure of authority in that valley, sir, it's not in what Carter did. It's in every no she got before she ever picked up that rifle." Captain Hale looked at the three of them across the table. An operator, a senior chief who was burning his own career, and a medic sitting calm and still in the middle. And Jonah watched the man do the math that people at his level always did, the math that wasn't about right and wrong, but about which outcome cost him less. "This board will recess," Hale said finally, pending the original range records and a review of these statements. We reconvene in 72 hours. 72 hours. Jonah knew what that meant. 72 hours was enough time for the people who'd sent Hale to decide whether to keep pushing or cut their losses, and there was no way to know which way it would break, and the not knowing was its own kind of torture. They walked out of the plywood room into the cold, the three of them, and none of them spoke until they were well clear of the building. That could have gone worse, Vickers said finally. It could have gone better, Jonah said. You threw your career on the table in their senior chief? Evelyn said quietly. You didn't have to say it was prejudice. You could have said it was a judgment call that went bad. Everybody would have let you. Instead, you put the ugliest possible word on it, on the record under oath. Vickers stopped walking. Yeah, he said, I did. Why? And Mason Vickers looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face broke open in a way Jonah had never seen. Because I've got a daughter, he said, and she's 14 and she wants to fly. Fighters. She's wanted it since she was 6, and she's smart enough and tough enough, and she's got the hands for it all. I've seen her on the sim. She's better than boys twice her age. His voice thickened. And for years, I've been telling her, sure, baby, you can be anything you want. And I believed it when I said it. And then I spent 41 days looking at you, Carter, and treating you like furniture, like a bandage girl, deciding what you were worth before you opened your mouth. He swallowed hard. And 9 days ago, I watched you do the most incredible thing I've ever seen a human being do after I'd told you that very morning you couldn't even qualify for a rifle. And all I could think about lying in that dirt was my daughter, in 15 years. Walking into some room in front of some man exactly like me who's already decided what she's worth. His eyes were wet and he didn't wipe them. I can't fix what I did to you, but I'll be damned if I'm going to go home and look my little girl in the eye knowing I had the chance to make it a little bit better for her and I stayed quiet to save my own career. So no, I couldn't say it was a judgment call. It was prejudice. Mine. And the only thing I can do about it now is refuse to let anybody pretend it was anything else. And Evelyn Carter, who had stayed dry-eyed through the review, through the accusations, through all of it, had to look away for a moment. Your daughter's lucky, she said quietly. Most fathers never learn it at all. And the ones who do usually learn it too late to say it out loud. I learned it about 30 years too late, Vickers said. But you learned it, she said. That's more than the range officer ever did. That's more than most of them ever do. She looked at him. When this is over, Senior Chief, whatever happens to me, you go home and you find that daughter of yours a real coach. Not somebody who'll go easy on her, somebody who'll push her the way my grandfather pushed me. And when some range officer somewhere writes down that her scores are statistically improbable, you make sure she knows what it actually means. Her voice hardened. It means she scared them. It means she was better than they thought a girl could be, and instead of believing their own eyes, they decided the test must be broken. It's not a mark against her, it's proof. You teach her to read it as proof. Vickers nodded, unable to speak. The 72 hours passed slowly, and then they didn't pass at all, because on the third morning the decision came, and it came in a way none of them had predicted, and it was the biggest twist of the whole ordeal. The range records arrived first. Jonah was in the room when they were unsealed the actual shot-by-shot scorecards from a qualification range 4 years earlier, and they were exactly as Evelyn had said. Expert scores, string after string, and the handwritten note in the margin, in a range officer's cramped hand, statistically improbable, likely testing irregularity, recommend retest, and below it the retest expert again, and below that lucky day and the final result left at marksman. It was all there in black and white, a documented record of the institution refusing to believe a woman could shoot. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was who walked into the room behind the records. The door opened and Captain Hale came in, and behind him came a man in civilian clothes, gray-haired, straight-backed, in the way that never leaves a certain kind of man, no matter how many years he's been out, and Jonah didn't recognize him. But Evelyn went absolutely white and then absolutely still, and her hand came up to her mouth and she said one word and it came out cracked and disbelieving. Sergeant Major. The gray-haired man's weathered face broke into a slow smile. Hello, Evie. And Jonah watched Evelyn Carter, the woman who had not panicked under machine gun fire, who had not cried through 23 stitches, who had faced down a review board without a tremor, come apart at the sight of an old man in civilian clothes, and he had no idea why until Hale spoke. Petty Officer Carter, Hale said, and his voice was different now, careful, almost chastened. When the board recessed, I did something I probably should have done at the start. I went looking for people who knew your background. And it turns out your grandfather, Master Sergeant Thomas Carter, is fairly well remembered in certain communities. And it turns out he had a spotter for 11 years across 2 wars. He gestured to the gray-haired man. This is retired Sergeant Major Elias Ward. He flew in on his own dime when he heard what was happening, and he asked to address this board. Elias Ward stepped forward and he put a hand on the table and he looked at the range records lying there. And then he looked at Captain Hale, and when he spoke, his voice was gravel and iron. I spotted for Tom Carter for 11 years, he said. I saw every impossible shot that man ever made, and he made a lot of them, and I'm here to tell this board something, and then I'll get out of your way. He tapped the scorecards. Tom Carter told me about his granddaughter 15 years ago, told me he'd been teaching a little girl to read Wind since she was 7, and that she had the best natural eye he'd ever seen, better than his, and that it broke his heart because he knew what the world was going to do to a girl who could shoot like that. His jaw worked. He told me, and I'm quoting the man directly because I never forgot it, he said, Elias, they're going to call her a liar. They're going to see what she can do, and they're going to decide it can't be real, and they're going to write it down as a mistake, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it because I won't be around to make them believe her. The room was dead silent. He was right, Ward said. You've got the proof right there on the table. Statistically improbable. Testing irregularity. They called her a liar in writing twice before she was 18. He looked at Hale and then he looked at Evelyn, and his hard old eyes softened. But here's the thing Tom didn't live to see. He thought the day would come and there'd be nobody there to make them believe her. He nodded slowly at Vickers, at Jonah. He was wrong about that part, because there was somebody. There was a senior chief who told the truth, even though it cost him, and there was a spotter who called the ridge and then wrote it all down and made copies so nobody could bury it. His voice caught just slightly. Tom, if you're listening, you old bastard, you don't have to worry anymore. The day came, and she wasn't alone for it. She had a team. Evelyn was crying now, openly. She didn't try to stop it, and she didn't look away. And Jonah understood that in 9 days of fighting for the truth, this was the first moment she'd been allowed to simply feel it, and that the person who'd finally cracked her open was a voice from the one man who'd believed in her from the start, delivered by his oldest friend across the years and across the distance and across death itself. Sergeant Major Ward, Captain Hale said quietly, for the record, will you attest to Petty Officer Carter's grandfather's assessment of her marksmanship abilities? I'll do better than that, Ward said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope soft with handling. Tom wrote me a letter 6 months before he passed. He knew he was going, and he wrote me about Evie, about how proud he was and how scared he was for her. He set the envelope on the table beside the range records. There's a line in here I want in the record. He wrote, my granddaughter is the finest shooter I have ever trained or seen, and I include myself and every man I ever served with in that statement, and I would stake my life and my reputation on it. Any board that ever questions what she can do can question me. Ward's voice was rough as broken stone. Well, he's not here to be questioned, so I'm here in his place, and I'm staking his reputation and mine on it right now in front of all of you. That 840-meter shot in layered wind from a cold weapon isn't statistically improbable, Captain. For Tom Carter's granddaughter, that's exactly what I'd expect. The only improbable thing in this whole story is that it took you people 9 days in a dead man's letter to believe her. Captain Hale looked at the range records and the letter, and the 3 people across the table, and the old sergeant major standing there with his dead friend's words in his hand, and Jonah watched the last of the man's resistance drain out of him, replaced by something that might have been shame and might have been resolve and was probably both. This board has heard enough, Hale said. He closed the folder. Petty Officer Carter, the review is concluded, and I want to say something that isn't in my official capacity just from me to you before I put on the record what I'm about to put on the record. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking much older. I came here to make this go away. That was my job, and I'm not going to pretend, otherwise you were right about that from the first minute. I looked at your file, and I saw marksman, and I saw medic, and I decided this whole thing had to be an exaggeration because it was easier for everyone if it was. He set the glasses down. I did to you the exact thing that range officer did, the exact thing the senior chief did. I decided what you were before I let you show me. And I was wrong, and the only reason I know I was wrong is that you had 3 people willing to burn down everything they had to make me look. He straightened. So, for the record, and Jonah held his breath. For the record, Captain Hale said, and he nodded to the note-taker to make sure every word was captured. This board finds that the after-action report submitted by Petty Officer Jonah Pike is accurate in every material particular. It finds that Petty Officer Evelyn Carter's actions in the valley were not a violation of good order and discipline, but the opposite. They were the direct cause of the survival of the entire patrol. He paused. It further finds that Petty Officer Carter's marksmanship qualifications were improperly recorded on 2 prior occasions, and it directs that her record be corrected to reflect her actual demonstrated scores effective immediately. He looked at her, and it recommends in the strongest terms this board is capable of that Petty Officer Carter be considered for both a decoration commensurate with her actions and for immediate advanced marksmanship qualification, which frankly, given the evidence, is a formality she completed under enemy fire 9 days ago. It should have been the moment of triumph. It was the moment 9 days had been building toward the moment the truth won and got written down in ink that couldn't be erased. And yet Jonah, watching Evelyn's face, saw something that surprised him. She wasn't celebrating. She listened to the finding, and she nodded, and her eyes were still wet from her grandfather's letter. But there was something in her expression that was almost troubled. And when Hale finished, she didn't thank him, and she didn't smile. She sat there for a moment, and then she said something that stopped the whole room. Sir, before this is finalized, I have one request, and it's not the one you think. Hale blinked. Go ahead. You just directed that my record be corrected, and you recommended a decoration and advanced qualification for me. She folded her hands. I'm grateful, I am. But I want to make sure this board understands something, because if it doesn't, then all of this was for the wrong reason. Her voice was steady and clear. Correcting my record doesn't fix anything. It fixes me, one person. It takes one woman whose scores got written off as impossible, and it says, oh, in her case, it turns out she really could shoot. And then everyone gets to feel good, and the range officers keep writing statistically improbable in the next girl's scorecard in the next, because nothing actually changed, except that one exceptional case got sorted out. She leaned forward. I don't want to be the exception, sir. Exceptions let the rule survive. If I walk out of here as the amazing medic who turned out to secretly be a sniper, then I've done nothing for the next girl except make her a slightly better story. The rule that broke me is still standing. The room was silent. Hale looked genuinely thrown. What are you asking for, Petty Officer? I'm asking that this board's findings not stop at my record. Evelyn's voice didn't waver. Those range scorecards on the table aren't just evidence about me. They're evidence about a process. A process where a range officer can look at a woman's expert scores, decide they're impossible because of who's holding the rifle, and downgrade them with a note, and have it stick for years with no review, no appeal, no second set of eyes. That process is still running right now, sir. It ran on me twice. It's running on somebody today. She tapped the table. So I'm asking that this board recommend a review of that process itself, not my scores. The system that let my scores be erased. Because if you fix me and leave that running, then in 15 years, Senior Chief Vickers' daughter is going to walk onto a range and shoot expert, and some officer is going to write statistically improbable in the margin. And she's going to have to survive an ambush and get shrapnel in her side and have 3 people burn their careers down just to get someone to look at her real numbers. And that's not a system. That's a lottery. And I'm not interested in being the lucky ticket. Jonah stared at her. 9 days he'd fought for her, and he'd thought the whole time he understood what they were fighting for, and only now in this moment did he see that he'd understood only half of it. He'd been fighting to make them believe her. Evelyn had been fighting for something bigger the entire time, something she'd never said out loud until this exact second, because she'd been waiting to say it at the one moment it might actually stick. She hadn't wanted the medal. She'd said so from the hospital bed, and it had been true. But she'd let Jonah talk her into the fight, and she'd let him think it was about the next girl in a general sentimental way, and all along she'd been holding this the real target, waiting for the range where she could finally take the shot that mattered. Captain Hale looked at the scorecards. He looked at the letter from a dead sniper. He looked at the old sergeant major and at Vickers and at Jonah and finally at Evelyn Carter. And Jonah watched a man who had come here to bury a story realize that the story had gotten completely away from him and become something he couldn't have imagined when he'd stepped off the plane. You understand, Hale said slowly, that what you're asking for is a great deal larger than this board's authority. A review of qualification recording procedures across the force. That's a policy matter. That goes to places I can't send it. You can recommend it, sir, Evelyn said. You said so yourself. You found people who remembered my grandfather when you went looking. You have reach. You have a voice in rooms I'll never stand in. A recommendation from an officer of your rank attached to findings this clear. With those scorecards as evidence doesn't have to win by itself. It just has to make it impossible for the next person to pretend they didn't know. She held his eyes. My grandfather couldn't do that. He knew what was coming for me, and he had no way to reach the rooms where it could be stopped. You do. That's the difference between him and you, sir. He'd have given anything for the reach you have and don't want to use. It was, Jonah thought, the single most surgical thing he'd ever heard anyone say. She hadn't demanded. She hadn't accused. She'd simply laid it out so plainly that refusing became its own kind of confession, and she'd tied it to the one thing that had already cracked the man open, the memory of a grandfather who died believing he couldn't protect her. Hale was quiet for a long time. Sergeant Major Ward, he said finally without looking away from Evelyn, you said Tom Carter told you they'd call her a liar and there'd be nothing he could do about it, that he wouldn't be around to make them believe her. That's what he said, Ward answered. Did he ever say anything about what he'd want if the day did come, if somebody was in a position to do more than just believe her? Ward was quiet a moment. Then he picked up the worn envelope and he pulled out the letter and he unfolded it with hands that weren't quite steady, and he found a place near the bottom. There's one more line, he said. I wasn't going to read it because it's private and it's the last thing he ever wrote me. But I think he'd want it read now. He cleared his throat. He wrote Elias, if by some miracle the day comes and somebody actually believes her, tell them not to stop at believing her. Tell them believing one girl is easy and it's cheap and it costs nothing. Tell them the only thing worth a damn is fixing it so the next one doesn't have to be a miracle. That's what I'd want. Not a medal for Evie, a world where Evie's granddaughter never needs one. Ward folded the letter carefully. That's the last thing Tom Carter ever wrote down about his granddaughter, Captain. Make of it what you will. The room was utterly still, and Captain Roland Hale, who had flown in to make a problem disappear, set both hands flat on the table and bowed his head for a moment, and when he raised it, something had changed in him for good. Add to the record, he said to the note-taker, and his voice was firm now, decided. This board recommends, in addition to the findings already stated, a full review of marksmanship qualification, recording procedures across all commands, with specific attention to the practice of downgrading or annotating scores deemed anomalous without independent verification. The board will attach Petty Officer Carter's original scorecards as Exhibit A of a demonstrated failure of that process. He looked up. And I will personally carry that recommendation to the rooms Petty Officer Carter correctly noted I have access to, and she does not. On my name, not because a review board directed me to, because a dead Marine asked me to through his granddaughter, and I find I'm not able to tell him no. Jonah let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 9 days. Vickers beside him had his eyes closed and his jaw tight, and Jonah realized the big man was thinking about a 14-year-old girl who wanted to fly. And Evelyn Carter finally let herself sit back in her chair. Not in triumph, in something quieter. The bone-deep stillness of a shooter who has taken the one shot that mattered and watched it strike true, and who now feels the strange emptiness that comes after when the thing you've carried for a lifetime is finally set down. Thank you, sir, she said, and this time she meant it, and it showed. After the board adjourned, they lingered outside in the cold, the 4 of them now. Ward included, and for a while nobody said much. The old sergeant major stood a little apart looking at the mountains, and Evelyn went to stand beside him, and Jonah and Vickers hung back to give them the space. He talked about you all the time, you know, Ward said to her quietly, not turning. Toward the end, when the pain was bad and he couldn't sleep, he'd call me at all hours, and half the time it was to talk about Evie, what you were doing, what you'd shot. He kept a folder. Newspaper clippings, your scores when he could get them, everything. He was quiet. He was so damn proud of you and so damn scared, both at once all the time. He used to say the hardest part of teaching you was knowing he was building something the world wasn't ready to receive. I wish he could have seen it, Evelyn said. Her voice was thick. Just once, the valley, or in there just now. I wish he could have seen that it worked, that everything he taught me, it actually mattered, it actually saved people. Ward finally turned to look at her and his old eyes were wet. Evie, he said. He knew. He didn't need to see it. He knew the day he taught you to read that curtain when you were 7 years old, that you were going to matter, that you were going to save people, that the wind and the math and all of it was going to add up to lives someday. He knew. The only thing he didn't know was whether the world would ever let you do it in the open or whether you'd have to do it in secret, restrained, the way you did for 41 days on that mountain. He put a weathered hand on her shoulder. And now you don't have to do it in secret anymore. That's what he wanted, not the medal, not even the shot. He wanted the day you'd get to be out loud and on the record exactly what he always knew you were. And today's that day. So don't wish he could have seen it, just live it. Live it out loud for both of you. That's how you let him see it. Evelyn Carter put her arms around the old man, her grandfather's spotter, the last living link to the one person who'd never once doubted her, and she held on. And for a long moment, the invincible medic who had controlled a battlefield and dueled a sniper at 840 meters and faced down a stacked review board was just a granddaughter grieving and grateful all at once, holding on to the only piece of her grandfather that was left. And Jonah Pike and Mason Vickers stood back in the cold and watched, and neither of them said a word because some moments aren't yours to speak into. That night, Vickers found Jonah outside the barracks, both of them unable to sleep for different reasons. You know what I keep thinking about, Vickers said. What? That morning in the brief, when she raised her hand and told me exactly where the ambush would be. He shook his head slowly. I've replayed it 1,000 times. And every time I want to be the guy who said, good catch, let's reroute. I want it so bad. But I know myself, Pike. If we ran that morning back 100 times, I'd laugh at her 99 of them. Because the problem wasn't that I made a bad call. The problem was who I was, the kind of man who couldn't hear it coming from her no matter how right it was. He was quiet. That's what scares me. It wasn't a mistake I made. It was a man I was. And you can fix a mistake in an afternoon. Fixing who you are takes the rest of your life. Jonah thought about that. You turned down the clean version, he said. When they offered it, you could have made the whole thing disappear and saved your own skin, and you said no under oath and called it prejudice with your own mouth. He looked at the older man. The man you were that morning doesn't do that, senior chief. So maybe you already started fixing it. Maybe that's what fixing it looks like. Not being a different man overnight. Just being a man who does the right thing the second time, even when the first time cost you everything to admit. Vickers didn't answer for a while. My daughter, he said finally, when I get home, I'm going to tell her about Carter. The whole thing, the valley, the review board, all of it. His voice roughened. And I'm going to tell her about her old man too. The part where I got it wrong. Because if I only tell her the hero parts, then I'm just building her another wall of grown-ups who never admit they were wrong. And she'll spend her whole life thinking the men who doubt her must be right because none of them ever say otherwise. He looked at Jonah. She needs to hear one of them say it, just once, that we were wrong and we knew it and we're sorry. Maybe if she hears it from me, she'll recognize it for what it is when she runs into all the ones who will never say it. That's a good thing to give her, Jonah said quietly. It's the only thing I've got to give her that's worth anything, Vickers said. Everything else she can get from a coach, that she can only get from me. The findings went up the chain over the following weeks, and Hale kept his word, and the recommendation for the process review went with them, carried on the captain's own name, into rooms none of them would ever see. It didn't change the world overnight. Things like that never do. But somewhere in a system that had run one way for a very long time, a stone got dropped, and the ripples started moving outward, slow and quiet and unstoppable. And none of them would ever fully know how far those ripples traveled or how many girls at how many ranges would someday shoot expert and have it recorded as expert plain and simple without a single word in the margin about how it couldn't possibly be real. But Evelyn Carter knew the shot had struck true. She'd felt it the way she felt every shot that struck true, that quiet certainty in the chest that needs no confirmation. And a week after the board adjourned, when the paperwork for her advanced qualification came through, and the notice of her decoration and the correction to her record, that finally 4 years and 2 wars too late changed the word marksman to the word it should have been all along. She read all of it standing alone in the cold, and she didn't cry, and she didn't smile. She just took the corrected scorecard, the real one with her real scores finally recorded as real, and she folded it up small and she tucked it into the same inner pocket where she'd carried her win log for 41 days on the mountain. And she said very quietly to a man 3 years gone, who she was certain in that moment could somehow hear her. It mattered, Grandpa. You were right. The day came and it mattered, and it was worth all the other days. Then she went to check on Decker, who was recovering 2 buildings over, and asking for her every day because the mission for Evelyn Carter had never once changed. It had only at long last been allowed to be seen. Decker was sitting up when she came in, pale and thinner than he'd been in the valley, with a drain in his side and a look on his face that Evelyn had seen 1,000 times on men who had come back from the edge and hadn't yet figured out what to do with the fact that they had. "There she is," he said, and his voice was weak, but his eyes were sharp. "The whole ward's been talking about you, Doc. The medic who won a firefight. They're saying you shot a guy at 900 meters. 840, Evelyn said, checking his chart. "And I didn't win the firefight. Nobody wins a firefight. Some people just get to walk away from it, and I wanted you to be one of them." "Well," Decker swallowed, "I'm walking, barely, but I'm walking." He was quiet for a moment, and then his composure cracked just slightly, the way it does with men who've had too much time in a hospital bed to think. "I never said anything to you before, when you first got to the firebase. The guys were giving you a hard time, and I never said anything. I just laughed along with everybody else." His jaw worked. "I laughed at the woman who put her hand in a hole in my gut and kept me from bleeding out. I laughed at her for weeks. And I never even said thank you because thanking a medic felt like admitting I might need one, and I was too proud for that." Evelyn set down the chart. "Decker," she said, "you want to thank me. More than anything, Doc. Then don't do it with words." She looked at him steadily. "You've got a long recovery ahead of you, and it's going to be brutal. And there's going to come a day, probably more than one, where you decide it's not worth it and you want to quit. Don't." She held his eyes. "That's how you thank me. You get all the way better. You get back to whatever you love. You live the life I kept you alive to live, and you live it all the way, and you don't waste a day of it. That's the only thank you I want. The words don't do anything, the living does everything." Decker's eyes went bright, and he nodded, unable to speak, and Evelyn squeezed his shoulder once and moved on to the next patient because there was always a next patient, and that had never changed, and it never would. The story got out anyway, of course. Stories like that always do. It moved the way true things move through a military. Quiet at first, told in low voices between men who'd been there, and then louder, and then everywhere, and within a month, there wasn't a person in the theater who hadn't heard some version of the medic on the mountain. Most of the versions were wrong and the details inflated or garbled the way stories get, but the heart of it was always the same, and the heart of it was true. A woman they called a bandage girl had been the most dangerous person on the battlefield, and they'd almost died because they couldn't see it. And one of them, a senior chief no less, had stood up in front of a review board and said so under oath. That last part Jonah noticed was the part that stuck with people the hardest, not the shot, the confession. Because everybody had met a man like the Vickers from that first morning at Firebase Anchor, the man who decided what you were worth before you opened your mouth. But almost nobody had ever met one who'd stood up afterward and named it out loud and taken the cost. That was the part that made the story more than a story. That was the part that made it a thing that could change somebody. 6 weeks after the review board, the orders came down separating them. That was how it always went. A war didn't pause to let people who'd been through something together stay together. Evelyn was being sent back to a training command stateside, and there was a note attached to her orders, unusual, personal, and it took her a while to understand what it meant. She was being assigned as an instructor, marksmanship. She read it 3 times before it sank in. The Navy, the same institution that had written statistically improbable on her scorecard twice, that had handed her a bag of bandages and told her that was all she'd ever be, was now going to pay her to teach the thing they'd spent years insisting she couldn't do. "That's Hale," Jonas said when she showed him. "Has to be. He pushed it through. He couldn't fix everything, but he could do that." He grinned. "You know what that means, right? You're going to be standing on a range in charge when some kid, some girl probably shoots a string that looks impossible, and you're going to be the one holding the pen. Evelyn looked at the orders for a long moment. Yeah, she said quietly, I am. And Jonah watched something settle over her face, some understanding of the full shape of what she'd been handed, and he realized that this was maybe the truest victory of the whole thing. Bigger than the medal, bigger even than the process review. They'd taken the woman the system had broken, and they'd put her in the exact chair where the breaking happened. They'd made her the range officer. They'd handed her the pen that had written the lie about her twice, and told her to go write the truth about the next 1,000 shooters who came through her door. Her grandfather couldn't have designed a better outcome if he'd lived to design it himself. The night before she flew out, the three of them ate together one last time, Evelyn and Jonah and Vickers, and it was strange and quiet and full of the things people don't say, because saying them would make the leaving real. Vickers was rotating home too, his own orders cut, and there was a question hanging over him that none of them had spoken aloud, which was what the review board findings would ultimately mean for his career. He'd admitted prejudice under oath. He'd refused a clean version that would have protected him. Nobody knew yet what that would cost. You hear anything, Jonah finally asked him, about your board, your future? Vickers pushed food around his tray. Yeah, heard today, actually. He was quiet. They're not gonna nuke me. Turns out an honest confession under oath combined with turning down a chance to bury it reads pretty differently than the same facts would have read if I tried to hide them. Hale wrote something in my file, said in 30 years he'd rarely seen a leader own a failure that completely, and that the Navy needed more men willing to do it, not fewer. He shook his head slowly. So I'm not getting relieved. I'm getting sent to teach leadership, ethics, the stuff about how you make decisions when the decision is really about who you've already decided somebody is. Evelyn set down her fork. They're making you an instructor. Yeah, same as me. Yeah. Vickers almost smiled. Different subject, but yeah, turns out the thing that nearly ended both our careers is the thing they want us to go teach the next generation not to do. He looked at her. You're going to teach kids that a woman can shoot, and I'm going to teach kids not to decide what somebody's worth before they've seen it. He shook his head. Same lesson, Carter. Two ends of it. You teaching them to be worth believing, me teaching them to do the believing. He was quiet for a moment. Kind of feels like the whole thing was pointing here the whole time. Like the valley was just the part where we found out what we were supposed to spend the rest of our careers doing. There was a long silence at the table. Can I tell you something? Vickers said finally, and his voice had dropped. The thing I'm going to open with. First day. Every class. He looked down at his hands. I'm going to tell them about a medic. I'm going to tell them there was a woman under my command who told me exactly where an ambush was 90 minutes before it happened, and I laughed at her because she carried a med bag. And I'm going to tell them that woman then saved every one of our lives wounded after I'd told her that same morning she couldn't qualify for a rifle. He raised his eyes. And then I'm going to tell them the hardest part. The part I still can't say without my chest hurting. Which is that the reason I couldn't hear her wasn't that she was wrong. She was never wrong. It was that I'd already decided who she was. And once you've decided who somebody is, you can't hear them anymore, no matter how right they are. You've made yourself deaf to them on purpose, without even knowing you did it. He swallowed. And I'm going to tell them that it almost killed 40 men. And that the only reason it didn't is that she was better than my failure. And you can't count on that. You can't build an army on the hope that the people you've decided don't matter turn out to be so good they save you anyway. Sooner or later, you meet the one who isn't good enough to survive your blindness, and then your blindness kills them. And it's your fault. And no review board in the world will make that right. Evelyn was very still. That's a good opening, she said quietly. It's the only opening I've got that's worth a damn, Vickers said. Everything else is just tactics. That's the only thing I know now that I didn't know before the valley, and it cost me 41 days of treating a good woman like furniture to learn it, and I'm not going to let it be for nothing. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't hide it. You paid for that lesson, Carter. You paid for it in blood and in 23 stitches and in 4 years of your record being a lie. The least I can do is make sure I'm not the last person who learns it from what you paid. Evelyn reached across the table and put her hand over his just for a moment, and neither of them said anything. And it was the closest thing to forgiveness that a person like Evelyn Carter ever offered, which was not words, but the simple fact of her hand on his, the acknowledgement that the man across from her was not the man who'd shoved her in the dirt, that people could become other than they'd been, that even a wall could learn to be a door. They said their goodbyes at the flight line the next morning. Jonah shook her hand and then thought better of it and pulled her into a rough embrace, and Evelyn, who was not a person who hugged, let him. "You were my spotter," she said into his shoulder. "In the valley, when it counted, I gave away my position to a shooter who could have killed me, and I did it because I trusted you to call the ridge, and you called it." But she pulled back and looked at him. "I've had exactly one spotter I trusted like that before you, Pike, and it was my grandfather. You should know that. You should know what it means that I trusted you the way I trusted him." Jonah couldn't speak for a moment. "I noticed you before anybody else did," he said finally roughly. "That's the thing I'm gonna be proudest of my whole life, I think. Not any shot I ever took. That I looked at a medic everybody else called a bandage girl, and I saw a shooter, and I was right." He shook his head. "Everybody else needed a firefight to see you. I just needed 2 weeks of paying attention. And I keep thinking, what if I hadn't paid attention? What if I'd been like the rest of them? You'd still have done everything you did in that valley, but there'd have been nobody to write it down, nobody to make copies, nobody to spot for you, and they'd have buried it, and you'd have let them, and the next girl would have been on her own." His voice broke. "So I'm not going to stop paying attention, Carter. Wherever I go, whoever I serve with, I'm going to keep looking at the people everybody else has decided don't matter. Because I looked once and I found you. And it turned out you were the most important person on the whole mountain. And now I know they're out there, the overlooked ones. And most of them won't get a firefight to prove it. So somebody's got to keep looking." "Yeah," Evelyn said softly. "Somebody's got to keep looking." She held his eyes. "That's your version of it, Pike. Vickers teaches them not to decide who people are. I teach them to be worth believing. And you just keep looking at the ones nobody else sees. 3 ends of the same thing. My grandfather would have liked that. He always said the shot is the easy part. The hard part is everything that has to be true before the shot, all the noticing and the reading and the patience. He'd have said, you 3 learned the hard part." The bird was warming up. It was time. "One more thing," Jonah said as she turned to go. "The kid, Vickers' daughter, he never told you her name, did he?" "No. It's Grace." Jonah almost smiled. "He told me last night after you turned in. Grace Vickers, 14, wants to fly fighters." He looked at Evelyn. "In 15 years, she's going to walk into some room in front of some man who's already decided what she's worth. You said that in the hospital, except now because of everything you did, maybe the room's a little different. Maybe there's a process review that means her flight scores get recorded straight. Maybe there's an instructor somewhere who was taught by a senior chief not to decide who she is before she's shown him. Maybe she never even knows your name or what you did or that any of it was for her." He held her gaze. "But it was. That's the thing about the shot you really took, Carter. The 840 in the valley, everybody saw that one. But the real shot, the one at the review board, the process review, this instructor billet, the one that actually mattered. Nobody's ever going to see that one land. It lands 15 years from now, in a room you'll never be in for a girl who will never know your name. That's the longest shot there is. And you took it anyway. Cold, in the wind, not knowing if it'll ever hit." And Evelyn Carter stood at the flight line and she thought about a 14-year-old girl named Grace who wanted to fly, and about all the girls she'd never meet, who'd walk onto ranges she'd never see, and about her grandfather, 3 years gone, who'd taught a 7-year-old to read a curtain in the wind because he always knew that she was going to matter someday. "My grandfather told me the hardest shot in the world is the one you take, knowing it's going to cost you, and you take it anyway because it's the right shot," she said. "But he was wrong about one thing. There's a harder one than that." She looked out at the mountains one last time. "It's the shot you take knowing you'll never see it land, knowing you'll be on or somewhere else or forgotten by the time it matters. You take it for someone you'll never meet, in a moment you'll never witness, and you'll never know if it hit." She turned back to Jonah, and for the first time he saw her whole face open, unguarded, at peace among. "That's the shot he was really teaching me all those years. I just didn't understand it until now. He wasn't teaching me to make the shot in the valley. He was teaching me to make the one at the review board, the one for Grace, the one I'll never see land. Her eyes were bright. He took that shot too, teaching me. He was dying and he knew it, and he taught me anyway for a day he knew he'd never live to see. He fired at a target 3 years past his own death, and he never got to watch it hit. She smiled, and it was the most peaceful thing Jonah had ever seen on her face. Well, it hit Grandpa. In that plywood room with your letter on the table and your old spotter reading it out loud. Your shot hit. I watched it for you, and now I'm taking my own. And I won't get to watch mine land either. But that's all right. That's the job. That's what he really taught me. You take the shot for the ones who come after, and you let go of ever knowing, and you trust the math because the math doesn't panic, and the math is always there long after you're gone. She picked up her bag, the same bag she'd carried onto Firebase Anchor, 41 Days a Stranger, and left a legend. And she walked toward the bird. And Jonah Pike called after her one last time, the thing he had wanted to say since the first day he'd watched her range an incoming round instead of ducking it. Carter. She turned. You were never the bandage girl, he said. Not for 1 second. Not on the first day. Not ever. And Evelyn Carter, marksmanship instructor holder of a decoration she never asked for, granddaughter of Thomas Carter's finest shooter she ever knew, until she surpassed him, looked back at the man who'd seen her before anyone else. And she said the truest thing she'd ever said, the thing that was the whole story in 6 words. No, she said, I was the reason you lived. Then she climbed aboard and the bird lifted off, and she looked down one last time at the men on the flight line, at Jonah with his hand raised at Vickers, standing straight and still beside him. 2 men she'd made better simply by being what she'd always been, and the mountains fell away below her, and she was gone. They tell the story still in the low voices of men who were there and the louder voices of men who weren't. The details drift. Some say the shot was 900 meters, some say 1,000, some forget her name. But the heart of it never changes because the heart of it is true, and true things survive the retelling. A woman they called a bandage girl was the most dangerous person on the mountain. They almost died because they couldn't see it. And when the day finally came, the day her grandfather always knew would come, she didn't ask for recognition, and she didn't celebrate, and she didn't gloat. She stitched the wounded, and she stabilized the dying, and she fought for the girls who'd come after her, and then she picked up her bag and walked toward the next patient, because for Evelyn Carter, the mission had never once changed. She was never support personnel. She was never the woman no one had to listen to. She was the reason that I survived on a freezing mountain in a forgotten war, and she was the reason a girl named Grace would someday fly, and she was the reason 1,000 shooters yet to come would have their scores recorded straight and true. She was a medic who became the most important sniper on the battlefield without ever once asking to be one. And in the end, every person who had ever looked at Evelyn Carter and seen only a bandage girl learned the same lesson written in her blood on a mountain that never forgot it. The most dangerous person in any room is the one you've already decided doesn't matter. She had told them exactly that from the very first day. They had simply refused to listen. Until the day it cost them everything, and she saved them anyway and made them finally permanently see.